See my phone? There's one on that
Oh,
side.
oh,
There's one
my.
on that side.
But thank you very much. I hope lunch was good. I hope everyone got a really fancy MyEther card. We weren't planning on handing out swag, but these arrived just this morning and they look so good. So if you didn't, come grab one. So the first session for this afternoon. The first session for this afternoon is on dispute resolution. Our goal between now and sort of 2:45 is to try and hash out what we think a reasonable target for dispute resolution would be. Like, should we have dispute resolution at all? If we do, what disputes should be resolvable? What should a legitimate claim to a name be? And you know, when should you be able to ask for it to be taken off someone else? And from a social point of view, how could that sort of thing work? How could we actually build a distributed system that helps resolve disputes and so on? And then later this afternoon, we should be trying to get into technical aspects, like assuming we came to any sort of consensus earlier today, which seems admittedly unlikely. How could something like that actually be implemented at a technical level in a way that works with Ethereum and distributed systems? So, go.
Oh yeah, I want to go first.
Can I suggest that we framework this just a little bit? So
Yeah,
that we
absolutely.
don't just like spin off the rails in every direction.
Do you have a
Yeah, do we have markers? For
Yes, we do.
whiteboards?
Yep. And I will proudly stand by the way. Would you like to stand by the
I
whiteboard? I'll leave it to you.
just, since I was
Yep.
suggesting, I feel like it was my job. All right, let's figure out what our like types of disputes are.
Wait. I think even before talking about dispute resolution, I think we need to have some precursor discussion about why is this even a topic that we're talking about?
Fair enough.
Okay, so why does it matter?
Yeah, why does it matter? Like,
All right, I'm gonna write the first one because trademarks.
But
okay,
trademarks
but
themselves.
that's still like, you know, making a list, right? I mean, that's not like, so like I want to ask like a philosophical question first, like what's in a name, you know? I don't know why any other name would sound sweet,
Sure.
right?
No, that's fine.
So I think there's going to be basically like two different philosophies that we're going to see here, right? One of them is that a name, and this is the one that I have, is that a name registration is a marketing service. It's a service for discovering something on the other side of the name. And then the other worldview is that a name is property, right? And there's and the way that you think about title, if you're thinking about a name as a resource versus as a marketing service, is going to be different, right? And one thing that might happen is that we say, oh, we're going to have like a title system for the names that involves dispute resolution, because it might be that the way that we allocate the names initially through auctions or first come first serve don't produce the most valuable name registry or the best experience for users or whatever desiderata that we have, right? So depending on what we want out of our name system, we may want dispute resolution, and you know, and that will in turn be contingent on whether we can find a system that we're satisfied with.
So I guess I'm assuming that what you're saying is that if names are a marketing service, then the goal of the dispute resolution system should be to maximise the usefulness of that.
Mm-hmm.
And if names are property, then the goal of the dispute resolution system should be to preserve property. Is that?
So if the point of the system is to just provide people with like reliable title, yeah, but you can have property in a system where you want, say, some other notion of efficiency. Like maybe you just want it to go to the highest bidder, and that's kind of the notion of economic efficiency that you're looking for.
Yeah.
The thing is, in a lot of namespaces, it's always been nebulous whether names are property or convey rights. But in some cases and jurisdictions, it's gone one way, and in others, like in Canada, you don't own your .cas, you only have the rights they convey. In the US, there's been some rulings that .coms are domains of property. But in either case, even if it's a series of rights, someone who feels they're being infringed is gonna say, well, that's my name, you know? So I think the big bucket is like contention. There's contention around use contention, and there's contention around non-use. Like some people think there should be use it or lose it rules, which I've always thought is not a good idea because it's completely subjective, but, you know, there may be a consensus to have something like that.
Yeah, totally. So, you know, from my perspective, like there needs to be some kind of rules about what rights are offered, and like when you register a name, like what rights do you have, right? And you know, is it like property that like can never be torn away from your hands, or is it something that's leased to you by the registry, which is providing a service, and they will lease it to you only as long as it thinks somehow that that's appropriate.
So with those two distinctions, to me it seems like disputes are largely gonna, like the disputes of the property-based disputes seem much more objective in my head.
I guess it's more difficult to think of what you would dispute in a property-based thing. Like if it's your property, what is the source of dispute?
Well, it's sort of like, well, who owns the name?
Was it stolen? Maybe
Sure.
ownership.
And if it was stolen, in theory, that's like an objective.
Yeah.
You almost even have to back up even one step further and say, okay, are we just gonna do a pure possession is 100% of the law, or, you know, do you say part of the registration process, and I can't remember if I went through this or not, do you have to agree to like a user registration agreement when you register a .eth, and if not, should we have one? I mean, that even opens up the door to what goes in it, but like, is that one of the boxes in the diagram of like user okays the end user agreement, because that's where they agree to abide by dispute resolution processes, that's where they agree to follow this set of rules, not that set of rules, and all of that gets put into that box.
So that's more about responsibilities. What responsibilities do you have as a domain owner, right?
Yeah.
Also, though, I guess I want to say that, like, you know, whether it's property or not, isn't the property-ness of something isn't like a sharp line where like here it's like immutable transferable titles, and then over there is like communism or fascism, or choose your favorite, you know, enemy. Yeah. And it's somehow like you have different rules for title in different type systems, and so like the extent to which names, like so that's kind of a question, like what is a title to a name? What do we want out of a title to a name for a domain system?
And I would say part of it should be a bundle of responsibilities, whatever that is, right? So you have your title to these rights, and you also have a title, you also have a burden of responsibilities.
But that kind of would suggest that if you fail to meet those responsibilities, then you might lose your access to your name.
And
which would require dispute resolution as long as that determination isn't fully algorithmic.
yeah, that's where it gets harder.
And ultimately, I think this comes down to, like we said, what we want out of the name service, but what we think are the most important variants to preserve. I mean, my own view is that even more so than with ENS, we should value stability very highly. We should generally try and avoid anything that introduces uncertainty into name ownership unless there is a prevailing, social good that exceeds it. And I mean, I guess I'm on the marketing side of things. I think marketing seems like too narrow a term, but it's the right direction, which is that names are a service, a usability service, a user interface service that makes systems discoverable and usable, and that the system, if you want an objective function, like a way to assess how successful the system is, it's more successful the less often it surprises people. And the dispute system should try and serve to maximize that function. And that means taking names off people who register them with deceptive intent, such as phishing, for instance, and reassigning them to the legitimate owners, deciding whether. But it also means preserving stability and not taking, long-held names that are known off person A because person B theoretically has a certificate title.
Yeah.
That's right. Oh, no, we just have to push the button.
No, I checked.
It has a U7 fault on the copy.
So I guess the question is how much in accordance are we with what we think the primary goals of the name system are, and what it should try and preserve.
Maybe I'm being not so clear cut on this, but say, okay, you have this marketing
Okay,
service
I'll wait for you to
that kind
comment
of
on
is
that.
dependent on any kind of property rights in the first place, and you have a digital landscape you're carving up. So do we have to solve the property rights before we can even talk about any sort of extra abstraction rules?
What property rights are you talking about there?
Well, for example, I mean, regardless of how you do it, like there is a landscape where there's a finite amount of strings and they can all resolve to whatever they resolve to. And any way you look at that, there's a digital landscape, and you're cutting it up regardless. So how I see it is like that's still property in some form, and it needs to have some formalization around that. And then you build marketing extra abstractions on top of that. Am I not understand that correctly, or like where's the distinction?
So I think building extra things on top to make it a better marketing service is one of the routes that is possible to take. But to me, when I say property, I'm thinking not just about the fact that this resource is being governed by the registry. I'm thinking about the fact that, like, okay, this piece is given to someone called an owner who has the ability to reassign what it is pointing to, who has the ability to deregister, to maybe transfer ownership. I'm not exactly sure what right now registrant has the right to do.
At the moment, they can deregister the name after a year, they can transfer the deed at any time to anyone, and they can, on the ENS registry side of things, create subdomains, set resolvers arbitrarily as they wish.
And change their registration.
What do you mean by change the registration?
Because initially they register some value there, or so after they own it, they reserve something.
Yeah, they can change the resolver and owner of that name in any subdomain.
Okay.
Instead of having a dispute process, did you have the oracles assess whether a name corresponds with a real world resource, like a Reddit username or a trademark? And then you could have, when you go to that, the resolver or something in the system could say, yes, this is legit like this is verified by the oracle.
So dispute process is just an efficient way to do that. Basically, you only do that if someone raises a flag. As opposed to doing it always.
Because you can have a lot of collisions there.
Yeah, so it concerns me that it's both too narrow and too broad, because it's too broad in the sense that it may well cut off legitimate users who actually own an overlapping trademark. It's also too narrow because if I buy Nike shoes.eth, then it's not going to come up for a search result for just Nike because it's a different string. But it should definitely probably be owned by Nike.
Could you have it, instead of like putting the resolver, maybe just put it like, I don't know, it would just be something on the very surface level, maybe in the browser level. It would just pop up and tell you, yeah, the oracle says this is good. But you resolve it no matter what, but I don't know.
Is the oracle in this case like referring to a human dispute process, or is it something
Yeah, it would be
pointing
similar to the dispute. It would be a human dispute process, but instead of reassigning ownership of the deed, it just determines whether that matches the real world.
So it's like
And then it'll show a warning or a redirect on the user side?
Yeah,
or
so I can comment on what my Etherwall plans, like we have, so right now we do this with addresses, right? If you are having like status, Heather ICO, bank Heather ICO, right? They can go in, they can do pull requests, or we do them a lot too. It's like, basically when you type in that address, it's gonna display a message and it says like, this is a message regarding this address, and if it's like, if I like personally, or they do a pull request, or I personally go like verify and find the address and like double check and like check with like a bunch of people, it says, this is the address for this ICO. Now, there's a phishing site that pops up and it'll be like, hey, this is the address for that ICO, and it's not that address. And so then what we'll do is we'll put a message that says, this is not the address for the status ICO, don't send here, you freaking maniac. They can still send it. We're not preventing them from doing anything. They can do whatever they want, but it's just a message on the top layer that says, don't be stupid, please don't send to this address that you just got slacked in or whatever. And so the plan with the ENS names is a similar thing. So basically, anyone has the ability to, do a PR. It'll probably like at some point be put onto like a contract or something more decentralized, but like at this point, it works. So we don't like it works. So we're just sticking with what works. But basically, if you were to type in myetherwallet.eth right now on my Ether wallet, I think that actually works. It'll say like, this is not, this ENS name is not owned by myetherwallet.com. So it's basically, as semi-objectively as possible, we're trying to say, in case you're thinking that we own this domain, like we don't. And so this is the thing that's really gets complicated is what makes someone like the owner of my Ether wallet? Like, you know, is this user coming, you know, if they're coming to our site and they type in myetherwallet.eth, it's a fair assumption that they're trying to donate to like us, not to like someone else. But in some other cases, like it may not be as clear. And so we want to make sure that like those messages basically say, you know, this is not this, in case you were thinking that, and allow the user to then make that decision in terms of like, oh yeah, I was trying to donate to my Ether wallet, you know, but if they really were trying to give these scammers money, they're free to do so knowingly. You know, we just don't want the user to be manipulated by that. That's our goal.
Obviously, the issue with that as time goes on is, you know, someone says, I'm going to send money to Fred.eth. Well, that may be registered to Fred.com, but not Fred.net or Fred.org or Fred.uk. So you know, how do we
Right, and
do that in a
that's what,
scalable fashion?
and that's the thing is like from our personal point of view, that would be, you know, okay, so, you know, it would be as simple as saying, if you're trying to donate to X person, go there. This is for this. And that's like the thing when you're thinking about dispute resolution, you have these like really obvious like manipulations where it's like someone that makes my Ether wallet with like one L. Like that's, you know, if they're trying to manipulate in that way. But then there's also, that's not to be confused with like just pure confusion in terms of like it's a generic name or it's a similar name and people think that they're the same. You know, and so there's always that, you know, how do you objectively do that? And there is not, I don't think that there's an objective way to do that. I think that there has to be some subjectivity, and like the steps that we've taken so far is basically put what we know are facts out there and hope the user, you know, like it's a fact. Like we know that status.im, this address is not associated with status.im. We're allowed to say that. You know, that's subjective.
Yeah.
Who status.im is irrelevant in that conversation. You know, because in that conversation, the user is trying to get to status.
So in that same vein, I think that the idea here is that probably try to stay away from solutions that are highly automated, because dispute resolution is inherently subjective.
I agree.
So oracles and, you know, things like that, like proving ownership of this or whatever, for the most part, those are not going to function as generic solutions. One, because, well, they're inherently subjective, and two, because abstractions like that, trying to abstract the idea of ownership, are like inherently leaky. And when you have an automated dispute resolution system like that, now we've opened up a situation where Nike shoes get stolen from Nike because somebody figures out how to side channel their way through that dispute.
Shoes.com takes that, right?
Right. So in this discussion, we're probably talking about how we set up a human system that can dispute these things.
So it's like arbiters instead of like automated oracles.
Yeah.
So I mean, just again, thinking of the high level stuff, do we want dispute resolution protocol, or do we just feel we're going to get forced into it, so we're trying to get ahead of the game?
If you want, we can do like a show of hands now and then one later and see what happens. Because I don't think there's a consensus, right?
What does want mean?
Can I just address one other thing that came up earlier first, which is people suggested a sort of out-of-band or a layered dispute resolution where it's some sort of system built on top. And I think that's a reasonable solution in the absence of better ones for blacklisting, but it doesn't solve all sorts of abuse. Because one legitimate case of abuse is registering a name for the purpose of denying it to somebody, and you can't solve that with a blacklisting system. And if your system instead applies rewrites on top of the existing system, then I think it violates one of the fundamental precepts of an objective name system, which I hope the ENS is, which is that everyone gets the same resolution, or at least resolved by the same authority. for a given name. And if you don't have that, you get really dangerous situations where someone goes, oh, donate to my ether wallet.eth. They're great because they were running the extension that fixed the lookup, and then the other person ends up donating to a scammer.
Yeah.
So if you're
So there's a bunch of complexity that needs to be either managed or, people can get hurt by it.
yes, but I think a fully fledged dispute system has to be part of the core system rather than layered on top personally. So if you were thinking of saying we don't need dispute resolution because we can just build it afterwards, then I'd offer a counterpoint. So
I think I think it would be better if we had a dispute resolution for everyone to still have the same name resolutions. That said, I would not be against extra protocol dispute resolution system that does blacklisting and read rights. Because it's better than, to me anyways.
Can you define that for me?
Sure. So the idea is that imagine we just leave ENS as a fully objective, just economic mechanism. And then we can have another contract where basically which is entirely separate, that uses this dispute resolution system to basically to blacklist names and to redirect names.
Okay.
And then you can choose if you want to apply this as a kind of filter on top of ENS.
Right. Do you want the base registry or do you want the dispute?
Yeah, or dispute registry filter 1, dispute registry filter 2,
right.
3, whatever. Yeah.
That real means what?
I know, right?
I really strongly feel that while blacklists fine, rewrites will cause far more trouble than they solve. They'll make things need worse.
I think they definitely have safety issues. Yeah.
Did you want to do a show of hands then?
Yeah, I'd be happy with show of hands.
So let's define the questions.
Okay, yeah, great.
So the question, as I see it at least, is do you think a dispute resolution system is a net good in ENS? Is that reasonable?
Or do you think we should have any kind of subjective mechanism for either deregistering or reassigning names?
Okay. And then this is whether you think it not whether you think it's inevitable, but whether you personally would like to see it.
I think that's even getting too granular. I think the question right now should there be a dispute resolution system?
So I think it'd be more general.
Because from there, it's well, then how you handle it? Because there's actually different, some the UDRP does a reassignment, but the URS, which applies to the newer TLDs, there's no reassignment. They just put it on ice.
But
deregister. So
the risk is that we all vote yes, but we're all thinking different systems.
Well, that's yeah. So some people might be saying you don't need a dispute resolution. So anyone who registers the name, that's it. It's just like cryptocurrency, baby.
So maybe
Jiggers names without dispute resolution. Maybe just having a reputation system of curators who just have.
Maybe we should revert the question and say who believes the system should be objective and purely objective and not have any subjective dispute resolution.
Should there be any way in which the owners of the ENS, the people who obviously can change ownership? Is really a fundamental question.
Sorry, the owners, you mean the registrants?
No, the owners of the registry.
You mean the root registry?
Yeah.
I mean the plan is to get rid of that, right?
Yeah.
Well, the owners of belief then, right?
Well, I would say rather
The question is, show of hands for who thinks that there should be no subjective dispute mechanism.
I think that's reasonable.
And would that include when you say dispute resolution, that means actually taking someone's deed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As a result of
whatever the arbitration.
Well,
yeah,
so to be clear, no,
Or a redirect.
taking the ability to set where the name resolves away. I don't think we're talking about actually taking their money.
Right, okay.
Although we're not necessarily.
As a side note, that's actually impossible under the current registrar. So they first have to agree to upgrade to a registrar that can take their money.
But before doing the show of hands, have we discussed what's the pros and cons of either way?
I think Vlad's idea is to get a show of hands first and then debate it and see if we convince anyone.
So are we happy with this statement of the question? Just whether it should be a purely objective economic thing, i.e. no inputs from any kind of sources that aren't verified actually by the smart contract project. So only like on auctions and fees and deposits and economic mechanisms for assigning names? And for reassigning them, deregistering them, etc.
No subjective input.
No subjective input, or subjective means verified by smart contract. Sorry, not verified, means not verified.
Confused yet?
Well, so you're talking about actually like under a circumstance that like someone has my wallet.eth, we could go and be like, that's ours and take it from them.
Well, if you vote for this proposal, if you vote in favour, you're saying there should not be such a system.
Normal circumstances, I would have to go do dispute resolution
Yeah, but that's what I'm
in
talking.
order to get the domain, yes.
Yeah, but what I'm
Does-
saying is you're
does
like,
anybody-
you're essentially controlling
Does
the
any-
domains, like you're deciding that we're gonna put in a system that controls domains for everyone else on the entire network.
Does anybody not understand?
That's kind of what it amounts to in some part, but there's a system, right? It's not
Okay,
like.
that's fine.
Yeah, I understand that that's sort of anti the entire network.
No,
Right, so this is exactly the conversation we can have, right? It's exactly where I want to go.
And just to get, it's a system we have today. Okay, that is
Yeah.
what we have today. If I turn around and say, you've got my domain name, I want it back. Tough is the answer, okay?
Yeah.
There is nothing at all I can do with sort of a crowbar
But if
to get the domain name back.
But if it goes with DNS,
You guys
then you might have recourse.
But you guys
But,
have taken
and
it.
I wanna comment on that later, not right now though, about my experience with trying to get domains, I don't even want the freaking domains, I just want the domains turned off. And there's nothing that we can do, there's nothing that does anything in the greater scheme of things that matters. So it doesn't, the dispute resolution that the UDSP, whatever that thing, is literally only for disputes. Like it's for like, I think I own Jaguar and he thinks he owns Jaguar and we want to dispute who owns it. Okay, in a situation where I own my Ether wallet and you own my Ether wallet with one L and you're scamming people, that system doesn't work at all and there's nothing that it can ever do for me.
That's an excellent point, because there's dispute resolution, which is two contestants over the same set of rights, and there's abuse resolution, which is this guy's running the CNC node off a botnet, or running a phishing site, or that kind of thing. And that's like two completely separate.
So this is.
And that's kind of why I try to be a little more general, say, any kind of subjective inputs, to cover like dispute resolutions and other types
And
of
then you gotta
systems
tease
that
it
could,
out later,
Yeah.
And it's,
change the registrations or turn them down.
it's worth mentioning that if there is a subjective system, it doesn't have to be a centralized one. It doesn't have to resort to, ultimate decision by a multi-sig or an individual or whatever. But it is possible for us to build more sort of distributed systems. So voting for or against, think about the ideal one, I guess.
Multi-sig, build all kinds of like
Yes.
multi-panel.
Yeah.
Multi-panel.
So we're leaving discussion about like the design of the system for later.
Who thinks there should be one and who thinks there shouldn't be?
Yeah. So do we feel like we're all on the same page? Anyone feel like we don't know what the questions are?
Yeah, I think I'm good.
Okay, cool. So who thinks it should be purely economic and objective?
I'm curious.
I count 5.
And with some uncertainty, with some uncertain hands also. Like kind of 2 uncertain hands and 5 And who thinks there like should be dispute resolution / subjectivity type of system there? In the ENS, not as an extra layer on top.
If we want it to be useful.
That's why we're on news.
I think one of the problems is like, yeah, go for it.
Who is highly uncertain how they feel?
Oh, yeah, that's me.
That's someone.
So I'm all over the place on this. So
I don't agree with the idea.
I mean,
But I could be persuaded based on, and maybe these smart people in this room, that there's a way to do it that is not the wrong way.
There's
Yeah.
some, and you can even start from, I think, sometimes you need a domain to come down, period. You know, like, forget, I'm an anarcho-capitalist, I'm all that stuff, but sometimes it's like, that domain over there, it's gotta go away.
Is it something like that just in DNS?
Here's one question. Maybe we can agree that there's both cases where it would be socially beneficial or beneficial for the quality of the ENS for a name to be taken down.
Yeah.
And we can also agree that the system for taking it down could potentially be abused.
Yes.
And so that's why it's a tough
So
conversation.
you could have one bucket called like ENS stability issues. If this is destabilizing ENS and Ethereum and
Sorry to interrupt,
blockchain,
they're gonna be bringing in some mobile air conditioners from David and Noise.
Okay, really?
Yeah, so that makes sense.
Yes, it's fine.
early Bitcoin miner.
So what might be useful is now to lay out some of the like obvious cases we want to talk about. Like what, like
Oh, yeah.
why would we want?
Great, yeah, that's good.
And I have a short list that I'll start the board with, and people can start adding. All right, so here's the one that probably we all agree with, which is kitty porn.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody This is a really easy one.
Somebody is going to extract that audio clip.
All right, so in the sense of things that people generally agree on, we want to stop at these kinds of things.
Yes, thank you for clarifying.
So what you really need to say is we want to deregister names that resolve to either kitty porn, IPFS hashes, or links to websites or whatever.
Given the ability to take down resources for this, we would want a dispute resolution system to be able to.
Is it about content or the name?
Yes, so this is unexpectedly controversial, I think. Is a name service responsible for the content that users point it at?
It's not so much about responsible, in my opinion. It's more like if we have a dispute resolution system,
It should get rid of kitty porn.
this is.
Find someone hosting a link to kitty porn, then it could transfer.
So just for clarification, so this is a case when someone have a kitty.eth who solve kitty porn, not about disabling kitty porn.
They've got a DApp behind this address.
So if kitty porn .eth hosts some like a
Yeah.
good, that's fine.
Yes.
So we are explicitly
Yes. It's explicitly about content. We are we are not the morality police in terms of bad words.
I was about to say, so before you even drill down to that level, putting in before person with the internet apocalypse, you should maybe just call that bucket content-based disputes. Right?
Okay,
Figure out what goes into that later.
Okay.
The other bucket is like intellectual property right disputes. The other bucket is like internet stability.
We have bucket number 1.
Which is like content only, yeah.
Put all our kitty porn in that bucket. Okay, who's got another bucket?
Phishing is an interesting one where it's not about the content, it's about the proximity to other names.
It's
It's about the content, right? Yeah, so my bad.
It's like malicious. I wouldn't call it phishing.
Abuse.
It's like malicious sites or like manipulative sites. So
But
like
those are still content based.
they're content based, yeah, but they're like
It's a
they're
separate bucket because it's like fraud.
and then so I would say that the difference between like kitty porn content and phishing content is that a lot of times the phishing name does play a role. So like whether or not like that's taken into account when we're talking about the resolution, I would say that like in general, like I feel more strongly about a domain like my Ether wallet with 1L being a phishing site than like we do have some people that like there's like one called like myethcoin.com or something. That's a phishing site for my Ether wallet. Okay, but like the domain name itself is I don't have a problem with.
So child abuse is abuse regardless of what name it's on, whereas phishing is only relevant if it's actually.
Well, it's more relevant.
It's more relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then it's really. I mean, I think that like in the case of my ETH coin, I don't think I messaged the registrar, not that domain.
I was about to say, have you ever tried to have it taken down?
Oh, we've had 300 taken down in the last 2 months.
Is it myETHCoin.com?
I don't know exactly what the
There's
name of that
E
one.
for you is one of them, and it's
Oh,
really
yeah.
our code, and it's not related to us at all, so it's like, these people are like, they're like,
But see,
well,
in
we
my
can't.
opinion, I do not go after, I don't go to the registrar if it's not like a my wallet.
Alright. We have a bucket though.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, we can talk about our problems all day.
Yeah, so it sounds like our buckets right now are like, there's a problem with the content versus there's a problem with the name. Like that's the part way these
Okay,
buckets are.
but there is a slight distinction between these, because this is like similarity and this is exact match.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
But
this
still
is
the
objective
issue-
and
the
this
issue-
is subjective.
I would expand trademark to just say IP, because we haven't decided what sort of IP is
Yeah.
relevant yet.
I would say on that
But
second.
somehow that might be an issue because of the content and not because of the name.
I mean,
Yes,
we're kind of,
exactly.
we're digging into future stuff here, but I would argue that in that case, it's not the name registrar's responsibility to take it down. Like, this is a much wider dispute about when is the registrar responsible for the content of the site it points to. But if I host a site called yay.com that sells fraudulent Louis Vuitton bags or something, I would argue that that's not the responsibility of the registrar for .com to take it down, because it has nothing to do with that.
Sure.
So on the content side, it would mostly be Swim's responsibility, because this content is on.
But yes.
Our content one is somewhat about whether or not we can actually prevent harm to people. That, I mean, it's a very small little thing, but it gets us started in a place. But this one is so specific, but it's about, you know, can we prevent significant harm to people? These start just getting into monetary things of.
So,
Are there other?
So I think having, you know, harm prevention. So harm prevention is one type of goal. Another one is kind of this kind of more like having the most useful names, right? It's more like to some extent it's going to be like the dispute resolution where two people want the same name. Another one is it's kind of like maybe we want to have a registry that like no one's made yet. I don't know. I think it's usually registered. I don't know.
The content one seems like highly subjective and messy to me. Like, I mean, it's jurisdictional and culturally dependent. And things might change over 1,000 years, or there might be some small culture on an island somewhere that thinks very differently to us.
So I mean, we struggle with this. This is one of our biggest things all the time, because you're either the DNS provider, the registrar, the web host, some of the above, or one of the above. And you're in a separate country, or you're not in a separate country, and you got various people coming at you saying, that site over there has got to come down because X, Y, Z. And we're like, this has nothing to do with us, we're just the registrar. We're not even the name servers go to that website provider, right? And so you're always, so at some point you have to decide, when is it going to be our problem? And what we decided was, when someone walks in the door with a court order that's valid in Ontario, then okay, do what you want us to do, right? You can get court orders from Poland and Russia, and it's like, that's all very interesting, but we don't know, right? Except for the exceptions are internet stability issues and obvious fishes, right? And that's basically it. And then, yeah, you know something, if you do see a kitty corn site, we will take it down just because it's like, nobody wants it.
So that suggests that concept doesn't need a dispute resolution system, because it's something where the root key holders just step in and do it.
No, I mean,
But it still gets,
it's not
as soon as you
scalable.
try to put a policy around it, it gets messy.
No, but that's what I'm saying, is
Yeah.
that you don't necessarily have to put a policy around it.
You
I
know,
mean, then your policy is like,
But we are
we're
trying to
gonna
create a
handle
dispute
these on a
resolution.
case
but
by
the dispute
case.
resolution
Yeah.
doesn't need to have a lot of
You know,
policy.
and I think that that's probably something that we should probably like consider strongly, is having less formal rules up front, and, you know, we're examining this in a year and 2 years, because I think about this a lot. I think about it from both ends. Like, I think about it as a person who has the ability to prevent people, like, on my Ether wallet from sending to a certain name or address. Like, we really do have that ability. And like, if you don't want someone to participate in ICO, like you could blacklist that ICO and people would be like struggling for that ICO. Like for real, like it's real, that's some power. It's scary, but like, you know, and then at the same time, the same exact like way, I turn around and I go to the domains and the registrars and the SSL service providers and the hosts and the CDNs, and basically everyone in between, asking them to take down these phishing sites, you know, because I'm getting emails every day about people losing money. So it's like, every case is different, and I'll say that most cases are probably gonna be very obvious. Like there's not gonna be, like in the case of kitty porn, there's not gonna be someone on the other side of that saying like, really guys, like we should do, like we shouldn't allow this, you know, but when you think about things in hypotheticals, that's where you have, like, suddenly, in this world of hypotheticals, there's like a bad reason for like not allowing kitty porn, you know, and that's, like, in my opinion, that's bad. Like, I think that if 99% of use cases are obvious and we all agree upon them, then let's just, you know, make some rules that have some structure.
Let's pick one that would really probably happen sooner than later on the Ethereum ecosystem, and that's dark markets.
Yeah.
And so what are we gonna do? I don't know what we would.
Well,
I don't have an answer. Oh, yeah, you nothing.
But see what?
So here's kind of like my little answer, right? Like you do what you can, and the system, the way we design it, is going to limit what it is that you can do to stop it, right? Because we can't let anyone change any name, right? And if we let no one change any name, then obviously there's nothing you can do. But there's like this middle ground of possibilities, and where people can do what they can in order to deal with certain issues, right?
No,
And
either there is someone who can manually change the ownership or registration of the name, or there isn't. If
well,
there is,
it's not that binary, right? It's someone who makes some things happen within some process, and not just someone, but some coalition, right? So it's gonna be some group of people who tick a bunch of boxes and pull a bunch of levers, who at the end of that process will. So there could be structure, right?
which is fine, but if it's possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so we go back to the about my wallet, right? You get to knock on the door. Sorry, we don't have our logs. We don't have them. And if you have the logs that are locked away behind multiple keys or whatever, or you have them somewhere offsite, you can still get to them, right? So they're either accessible or they're not. Change names.
But if you be harder or easier,
And
right?
it's still,
So we
it's
can go off
still
more
not
or
that,
fewer.
it's still not that binary because, like, look at the current situation. Now is a bad example since 6 of us are in the same room, but of the root key holders, you need to get 4 of them to agree, which means that if you want to push something from a court order, you need a court order that's valid in up to 4 countries.
Yeah, sure.
So it's not, you know, and that is a significantly different process to one guy just says yes, okay.
I also want to say,
I agree, but it's
Absolutely, it opens up the door to abuse.
hold on. I just want to say
Systems engineering
that
thing.
I don't think that we can even accept a system in which it is just absolutely not possible without a network hard fork to do that, because we lose our ability to hold kill switch.
Yeah, not safe.
By doing that, we also take away our ability to hold kill switch.
I have an idea.
And
But there is always hard folks.
there's always
You get kind of ashamed of what I'm saying.
It's gonna be like a little audio.
I don't want to like say, hey, we can't talk about that, but I'm proposing that there will be a way for people to step in based on the current design of the system, and if we remove that ability, we also remove a bunch of safety from the system, which is the ability for us
So
to step in and stop it.
I agree. I think the counter is, like you said, when we have that in place, it can and will be abused in some way, shape, or form.
I'm not talking about the dispute
right?
resolution
No,
system,
but
just the capability.
Just the capability.
absolutely. But again, unless dispute resolution policy is baked into the smart contract, and so there's no way around it. If it's an offline system where we sit around and make a decision, and then we implement a decision on the chain, then we can not make the decision in a normal way. We can just do it individually or whatever it might be. And so, yeah, it's tricky, right? I agree, I get it. My biggest concern with this in general is the idea that code is law. It's one of those things that we talk about, but it's not true. It turns out law is law, right? So as soon as we have the ability to do something, it will invite pressure from any number of external sources to do such a thing. Inside or outside whatever dispute resolution policy we dream up, that will be present. Now, yes, we can scatter the decision makers around the globe and different jurisdictions and all that fun stuff. That's a possibility. There's also ways of doing it too, absolutely. It's just one of those things that once it's possible, then it'll happen in some way, shape, or form.
Sure.
So it's just.
So we can make it really hard to have anything force our hand. And that, I think, is a good design vote.
I have a question. Can we prevent
Because in
the ownership switching thing? Sorry, like, okay, so we have two different things. Like, we can, let's say there's a dispute, right? And we have to resolve it. Okay, we can like say, okay, we're just going to turn this name off, and we're just going to ensure that it can never resolve anywhere. Or we can say we're going to take the ownership away and we're going to give it to a different person and let them resolve it wherever. And like in my case, I don't know, like I don't like the ownership thing. I don't like a third party like going and changing something. But I am okay with a third party. I'm more okay with a third party preventing something, like preventing access. And like in the case of my user wallet buddy, like I would be okay. Like I don't know how to say like, duh, like I want my user wallet buddy, but you know, in the grand scheme of things, like they bid on it, they got that name, like you know, so they got it. But my only fear with it, and my only fear since the beginning, has been a scammer using it to steal people's money and manipulate people and be malicious. And if you can ensure that like my user wallet isn't going to go to someone malicious, then like that's in my opinion, that's the greater good. You know, the greater good doesn't have to be doing good for me. It's just not. It's like just preventing like malicious harm.
See, under the current system, even though you don't have a trademark on it, well, you got a Swiss one, but you have like pretty clear-cut common law rights and prior use of that title, and you'd be able to go in and win and meet the guarantee. Well, depending on how they're using it, but you would probably be able to.
Yeah.
But that's a huge, horrendous process.
Well, no,
actually, that's why they came out with the URS, which is cheaper and faster.
Yeah.
But that's the one where the name doesn't switch; it just gets
just shut it off. Yeah.
So,
I mean, they've been up. Just to give you an idea, since July 5th, there's been about 375 names registered. Like they're basically our saving grace that they're literally running out of my Ether wallet variation supply. I'm not even kidding. Like that's how many domains they have. They've like resorted. The last one yesterday was my. And then instead of E, C, and then third wallet. Okay, you know, we had Waddle, my Ether Waddle the other day. That one got like, you know, only like 10K or some shit. Like, you know, I mean, this is like, it's insane. It's completely insane. And the system is in place. Just frankly, the host, I know everyone's in a tough position, but nobody takes these things down fast. Like nobody. The only people I will say that are semi-responsive are like Cloudflare, just because they're sitting there and they use my Ether wallet. Okay, like I can contact them on Twitter. I'm not going through their dispute resolution where they have 8,000 other things.
So to answer your original question, we could, yes, build a smart contract that the only permissible result of the dispute resolution is zeroing out the resolver. You know, meaning that they can no longer do anything with the name. And presumably some way to reverse that, but you know, you could limit it in that fashion.
I mean, I think it's worthwhile to talk about that. Like,
so there's multiple dispute resolution providers. You could actually build into the model where you say, you know, there are different dispute resolution providers, their decisions are recorded, and there's also the process itself can be, like if you dispute one of my names, so you take me to, and you say I'm going to go to the National Arbitration Forum or WIPO, you've got various different choices, and then you can like, I actually wrote a section on this, I should know it, but it's like if the complainant says I want a 3-person panel instead of a 1-person panel, then the other guy gets to say, okay, you each pick a panel, and then a third one gets randomized. And then, so you can have different dispute resolution providers, and that sort of almost becomes a force in when you bring a complaint, which resolution providers sort of work better in different situations. And then the idea I had was, I don't know, is this crazy? You put a menu of governance structures when you register a name, and you say, okay, so here's what governance structure A, and it costs 0.1 ETH, and this is what it means. And here's governance structure B, which costs 1,000 ETH a month, and it can never be taken down. You know what I mean? And that's sort of a thing, and then so you can sort of, without overthinking it, just sort of say these are different situations you can choose for different.
Rather than just finding a way out of being in a dispute resolution policy, right? I'll pay my 1,000 each, you can't take the name off me regardless.
Exactly.
That's
It's a hard fork, and then.
Let's not make that part of the
As long as the
discussion too
phishing
much.
site takes more than 1,000 a week, then they're gonna go for it. So how do you choose what the price is?
Well, okay, so again, that comes down to choosing, we're talking about two different things, right? We're talking about a dispute in perception of rights, okay? So it could have nothing to do with a phishing site, right?
Yeah.
I could be selling shoes and you could be selling houses, and we have the same name and we both have trademarks, go, okay? Let's have a fight. Or there's like what you deal with every day. That's like phishing, and that shouldn't even be a dispute resolution process. That should be a violation of an acceptable use policy that has a different mechanism for saying, okay, yeah, that's obviously a bunch of crooks, and it should come offline no matter which governance structure it's up, because it's all governance structures would be subject to at least some basic, you can't use this domain to murder people, and sort of trickle down from there.
So I find it interesting, like from my research at least, that the way ICANN handles it is they only have the UDRP, and everything else, like abuse and so on, is up to individual registrars.
Yeah,
So,
ICANN handles it by not.
yeah, so if you register the name with GoDaddy, then they have one process for taking down phishing domains, and if you register with reach.ru, they have no process for taking down domains.
They have one, it's just a like 10-page Word document in Russian, and then you have to go to Russia and give it to them.
So that doesn't seem like a pattern to follow here necessarily.
Yeah.
But it does, like, it's similar to what you're talking about with different registrants, that you could choose your registrar and that would have its own policies above and beyond whatever the is.
Yeah.
But of course my concern is that then fishers just venue shop for the one that's most convenient to them.
Yeah. Would it be possible for us to, I don't actually know if this is a good idea yet, but rather than us coming up with what the dispute mechanism is, for us to open up some parameters for people to nominate. We would like to be a dispute resolver. This is our process.
This is ICANN's approach, as I
Is that
understand.
what that is?
Yeah.
And then for the multi-sig, essentially to have a list of approved dispute resolvers. And that way, we're not part of the, like, I don't think that this group can handle being a dispute resolution system, nor should we necessarily. It's not our expertise. We are not a room full of lawyers, but we might be able to evaluate people who are experts in that and whether or not they come to the table with a solid plan.
Before going down that route, like, is it really too complex to try to do some decentralized, like, reputation and challenge system?
I was just thinking that
Like-
we're in a unique position to do that.
Yeah,
Create
like,
a reputation.
A lot of the systems for dispute resolution that I've looked at involve reputation systems. Because if you want to make them open so that anyone can potentially become an arbiter, and you want to sample arbiters in order into have committees, if you're opening yourself up to civil attacks, if you don't have that kind of.
Did you need a reputation system for arbiters or for the actual
So-
entities?
So pretty much, say if I see, some scam my Ether wallet site, I could basically submit it as a potential, like, point of dispute, and people can basically attest to that actually being a malicious domain and build some sort of system around that.
And then the clients, like the browsers and apps can subscribe to that system, and so then you get a warning, like boom, big red line.
Exactly.
This is probably a
Is there a
scam.
way to make it so that you don't have the same person attributing 1,000 times that that's that domain?
We're talking about solving like one of the really hard problems in this space.
Yeah, totally, exactly right. Yeah.
That's one of the really hard, whoever solves that problem, whoever comes up with a real solution for that problem.
That's
Yeah.
fish tank. Fish tank pretty well works, right? Like fish tank doesn't really get false positives.
What's
And
Fish Tank, sir?
Fish Tank is it's just a big database. I think it's run by OpenDNS, and people just it's got a browser plugin and an email plugin, and it just sort of reports this is a fish, and it goes in the Fish Tank, and then so suddenly you get an email that's in Fish Tank. It'll like if your client's enabled, it's like boom, this is probably a fish, same as in the browser, right?
Yeah.
And if it's a false positive, you can then go to Fish Tank and say, hey, we're not supposed to be in there. And they can then do a manual inspection.
So there's a few different ones that do it. Like phishing is one of them. Web of Trust is another one, which is an extension. And then there's also the specifically for email. There's like the spam boss guys, and then there's so there's like 4 or 5 big lists for email specifically that basically, if you're like in a corporate environment, you use one of these spam protection measures, and the spam protection measures get from these databases, and then like the people are phishing for the people that are taking that are the intake for the spam or for the phishing or for the whatever malicious activities going on. And like in my opinion, like we need that. I mean, we're working on that. We have like the pieces are all set up. We have the database thing that's being worked on. We have the MetaMask implemented too, so we have the other database thing that's being worked on. The either I just looked up is the first one. That's what the blacklist is now. We have the report system that's now on both that then feeds into webhooks and you know, those things are all I think those live on with third parties.
So speaking from experience, Spam House and others are quite prone to false positives and tend to be fairly resistant to removing them. They very much are in favour of false positives instead of false negatives. When I worked on the App Engine team, App Engine itself, the entire infrastructure would regularly get listed as a spammer, despite us attempting to work with them to allow them to distinguish like different App Engine users from each other. And they would even block incoming mail to App Engine on the basis that some of the outgoing mail was spam. So these things can certainly fail badly.
Well, I mean, we blacklisted ourselves for a day.
Yes.
Because we did the new Levenstein distance, and then someone was like, I think Erin actually did the pull request it. Her mom was like, I don't think you did this on purpose. I'm like, sure, my girl was just like on the blacklist. You know, but you live and you learn.
Would there be a way to incent people to report phishing sites and then disincentivize people from reporting false?
As long as enough of the people are honest, yes.
So
Well, then you can be rewarded for reporting badly or.
what's the motive for people doing the false report usually?
Oh, it's easier to just not bother looking at what it is and just collect money.
For that matter, you could set up your phishing money for wallet site and then take down the real ones so that you're the only one left.
Oh yeah, that's another one also. But just more generically, you know, if you for any one of these subjective systems, the idea is that you want it to produce somehow like a truthful result. But somehow that's generally harder than producing bogus.
Yeah.
But like the smart contract, who's like taking the result can't really tell the difference, right? And there's like classic trade-offs between like liveness and safety, where like if you have like unanimous consensus between everyone who's providing data, like n times in a row, with like n going to infinity, that's not like the safest system ever. Because like if anyone ever has a second doubt, they can kind of stop it. And so if there's at least one honest person, then they'll only return like good results. But then if one of them is missing, then you don't get anything, right? And also like unanimous consensus, I mean, it doesn't really work, but it certainly doesn't scale. Like, it doesn't work because of the liveness issue, even in small numbers, but when you get very large numbers of people, like unanimous consensus is very, very important. And instead you need to think about not needing unanimity, maybe needing only some majority of the people who show up, and then the security really, you start to sacrifice a lot on security for that. And one of the best kind of mitigations for all of these is escalation, right? Where basically like, if something is controversial or people raise enough alarms, then more people look, or more high reputation people look, until eventually you can get to one of these places where like everyone has to look, and then that's where you can get like the most kind of stage. And then if it's still controversial, then
would it be possible to build something like this within Augur?
I mean, so Augur could use something like this, and do use something like this for resolving markets.
Well,
Yeah, those dispute resolution and then Augur,
It's not
escalate.
yeah, but I think it's imagining, like, what if your dispute resolution is just asking Augur who
Is
should
it
own this
prediction
thing?
market?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I want a prediction record. It's just, doesn't.
Yeah, everyone wants that.
Should I have this thing?
Is that the bed?
Yeah, I mean, the issue with prediction markets in general is that you have to resolve them somehow, and the oracles that resolve that prediction market are going to be, okay, so in the case where you don't have an oracle to resolve the market, then you start to lose the actual guarantees that a prediction market gets you, because it resolves itself, and you can kind of just like push the truth out, right?
Who should own Augur.e?
It did?
Yeah, our project got swatted.
Oh, good, that's fun.
I think someone forgot to build that up.
Oh, that's good, also.
Did it happen?
What?
I said you didn't mean tonight, but you didn't.
No, I think someone tried to get it.
And they did enough, but didn't reveal.
Yeah, it didn't reveal.
Well, I mean, you want Augur anyway, not
Yeah,
Augur
exactly.
project.
Yeah, so there are limits to what I think can be done with the prediction market thing. And if you already have oracles that resolve the market, then somehow you've already solved the problem.
Yeah.
But the self-resolving futarchy is, works and it's majority honest, but it lose.
It's theoretical, and it's almost a UX and attention problem that we need to be close to. Because you need all of those people to be actually paying attention and to show up and want to show up.
Yeah, I think of it as a scaling problem, because when you get to large enough scales, you can't get them to show up.
Right.
So you have to deal with the fact that they're not going to show up. But it's similar, yeah. If you could get everyone to show up, then actually it's a lot easier.
So trying to get things back on track, we're kind of getting diverted into how we would implement a disputes process, which there's room to talk about later, but we haven't really decided on what should be disputable. So we want to return to these.
So one thing that did kind of come up earlier, I'm not sure if it was sufficiently flagged, is the idea that just shutting down the name is enough to prevent a lot of abuse.
Yes.
And maybe it won't maximize the value of the registry from the point of view of having the best names on there. But it will certainly be able to, say, shut down phishing sites, child porn, other things that we maybe discover are kind of bad enough.
I still think disputes and abuse are two
Completely
separated buckets.
Yeah.
Separate traps.
So that's a good question. I agree they're separate things. Do they need separate processes, or can one process be? So why do you think they need separate processes?
Because abuse, when you know it, when you see it, it's an easy takedown. Disputes is a dispute.
Just because something's an easy takedown for us as humans who see as a protocol, doesn't mean that the smart contract knows any better, right?
Well,
The smart
content is
contract
also
view,
already,
it's not obvious, it's just
always
like
another
arbitrary
side of
behavior.
the content. Like, someone can make up a smart argument that is not doesn't agree with you.
Even if you're both human interventions.
So there's literally, with phishing and stuff, there is literally someone taking money from, using someone else's stuff to steal money. So that is obviously there is a red flag right
It's
there.
a subjective thing though,
It's
because
still content.
sometimes
It's
you
just
get.
that the content results in stealing money.
Well, yeah, it's
Phishing
the intentions behind it, how the content's used versus kitty porn is kitty porn and it's bad, but there's someone out there, there's lots of people out there that don't think that. And they will make arguments about it. And
But this-
you still have general consensus, it's kitty porn is bad, if we can take it down, we should.
My point is that when we argue hypotheticals, these conversations come out. We don't need to have them because I would guarantee you no one is ever gonna, come up and try to argue that their kitty porn's okay.
Okay, but here's the thing.
Like, they just don't, and if they do, then we deal with it with the knowledge that we have at that point in time.
It's still a subjective process though, because you take someone who registers myetherwallet1l.com who runs a phishing site, and it's like, what's the remedy? You take down the domain. Then you get someone who hacks somebody else's WordPress domain and sticks myetherwallet down in WP plugins, right? You don't take down their domain because that's a security compromise.
Right.
Get them to
Right.
So that's still a subjective process that I don't think you can explain.
And this is
I
why
think
the
we're
stopping
having some kind of language issues somewhat because subjective and objective means a different thing to humans than to smart contracts.
Right.
And so what you mean maybe is not that there is no truth of the matter, but that it might be kind of hard to measure, hard to get out, and we might just honest people might disagree.
Or you still might need a human intervention to make the final call.
Okay.
To say, this domain's gotta come down, that is like a security breach. But it's still two different tracks. There's still, that's an abuse conversation that the abuse process has to look at, and then there's a dispute silo that's like a completely different conversation.
I think that makes sense from the point of view of the people who are processing them. I'm not sure that the smart contract knows any better. Like, smart contract may not know why it's getting this order, right? It just knows that it needs to change name or deregister.
I mean, from the social point of view, I'm still not convinced that they need to be separate processes. I guess the ability to expedite abuse because it's simpler would be a good reason, perhaps.
But also a certain, like, I might want to look at disputes, but I might not want to look at abusive websites, right? And so, like, from the point of view of the people who are providing the service for the various governance components, like they might not want to be engaged in activity A, want to be engaged in activity B, because like A is like more traumatic.
The other thing is the outcomes are different. For content and abuse, you shut down the resolver. For trademark or IP, you're transferring the ownership or whatever it might be. So they're different beasts in that respect, I think.
If that's how you decide to deal with it as like the transfer thing, the thing is if you just reject, like basically if we wanted Mindfall but we didn't get it, we didn't bid on it, we lost it, technically we should have, my opinion is we should never take it from them.
Yeah, that's mine as well, and in the real world, I take them all the time.
Yeah, they
But
bought
what if
it.
they set up?
But I don't like it, but I mean, we have a pile of my wallet with likes.
What if they set up a complete knockoff of your site?
They do.
There's lots of them.
That's the thing is like,
Yeah, but then you would, if we could have them all taken
We
down.
want to take it down, but like I don't think I should be able to take them from them. Like they should get projected, like they should get shut down and no one should be able to use them.
But that's right, that's what I'm saying. Content or phishing or abuse, they just get shut down, right? You don't get them. But you could legitimately say, my wallet, I should take that as mine because.
right.
So when we say they're two different processes, one involves just, we don't care about, frankly, who's on the end of it, because there's only one person involved in the complaint with the content or the abuse ones, and that's whoever's at the site. Whereas the trademark and IP ones, there are two people in conflict, so they are very different beasts in that respect.
Well, you always have a complainant and an incumbent.
Yeah, but one fights back and one doesn't.
not
Like,
in
they just don't come out and be like, no, I rightfully own this domain. And I don't even know, if you had a set of rules in place about what, like, who deserves a domain or whatever, right? And the person who currently owns myetherwallet.e, I went after them, right? If you had a set of rules, like, you don't know what he would do. He might be like, oh yeah, well, the rules say that it's theirs, rightfully, okay, whatever. Or he might be like, no, this is mine, and try to argue it, But the bigger one, and this is one that like I don't have any experience with, is the one where it's like the two legitimate companies with a name that's, I think Jaguar is the one that's the big case study on it, right?
I don't know that one. Monster, so Monster, the cable company, has tried to sue Apple for Monsters, the movie, and the drink company. They failed because Disney has a lot more money than they do, but they tried because they have.
But they took out a lot of little companies too, like they
Yeah,
did.
they have put tons of companies under for using Monster in their advertising or something, not even like using it as their name. So like this is something that does happen in the real world with real companies that are like just messed up.
And that, to me, that's dispute, like, cause that's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
someone has to resolve that shit.
Well, let me,
Like, that's what's so scary to me.
But even in the case where someone reports abuse, there's gonna be someone who needs to like do something about it. And
Right.
the structure of it is gonna be different, right? Because like for example, like I really like this idea of like, okay, each side gets to appoint half minus one of the arbiters, and then the tie-breaking one is chosen at random.
Yeah.
Or something, so like something like that wouldn't be as likely to show up in the abuse case, maybe than as a dispute, as like an actual solution.
Is it useful to think about this as more like a recommendation engine and then leave the intent and the decision up to the user as long as the UX is kind of giving them a choice?
So the next position on this is I think like, pretty spot on in some way, which is that like if it redirects what the name is resolved to, like changes what they resolve to, so in a way where two users can have two different resolutions, then that causes a safety problem.
And the overall usefulness of the system goes way down.
Yeah, also that.
So if it's an optional layer on top, then you will inevitably have two different types of users, and then they see
Right.
internets.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
don't have an optional layer that doesn't redirect,
It just blocks, yeah, and so that would cause less compatibility issues, right? Because we would never resolve different things. It's just like you might resolve a name while I can't, or don't.
That's it.
Well, I mean like a recommendation system, so it's like, okay, you type in like myethikwall@something.com and it goes, hey, maybe you meant this.
As long as it doesn't let you take over
Yes, exactly,
something,
yeah.
then now you're just talking about ad blockers and things like
Yes,
that, which is utility. I think, so on some level, that indicates that we don't need to build a dispute resolution system that takes names down, because that can be done in a layer that sits on top of ENS. And that's a decision that users can choose. But that doesn't fix the I should own X.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I feel like first come, first served, that's how it's been, like you can't, so it's like I own Montana, that's mine. And like as long as I want, I already own it, like in the way that it's set up, like I should own that as long as I want. No one should ever, and there's a lot of Montanas on the planet, like there's a city that has
Okay,
this called.
and that one's pretty easy to decide on, but what about Facebook?
If Facebook, if someone else buys it and wants to sell it to Facebook, like that's the thing, it's like I think the decision was made, just that name squatting was something that could be done.
Yeah,
But it sucks, but like.
so it's the main reason why you feel that you should have this right to own forever, and anyone should, because those were the rules people were set up with, and that's what their expectations are, because that's how it's set up.
I think that my opinion of like the entire like Ethereum network is that's how it should be. Like, but on top of that, it is how it was set up. It was like now how it is, and now you're gonna go back and change it for about like what, 188,000 people that have done this.
Yeah.
I think my thinking is we focusing so much on what we should do, but we still be in a too early stage to even figure out how many names being registered, like 800,000 or something. We don't even know the ratio of dispute right now. Is it better to focus on how many disputes even exist right now and what people think they have dispute? Maybe trying to figure out the cases is more important than try to act on them, because we don't know. Because, for example, Facebook, if someone buy it, unless Facebook thinks that that's dispute, we don't even need to resolve for them for the things. They don't really care.
But also we need to like understand that abuse will happen, and that there will be disputes, and kind of think about it ahead of time so that.
Yeah, but like, I think
we're
the discussion that my interval is here helping us to form the discussion a lot, because probably they're the first prime example having victim of this thing. So then having their opinion a lot helps more than we guessing or what it would be. So I think it feels like we need to discover demand.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
true in some way, but I also think that from the point of view of kind of like, okay, if we think of ENS as like a system of rules that like institutes a name system that is like beyond any organization and has certain roles in them. The roles themselves have certain abilities and incentives inherent to them that we can think about kind of abstractly from the individuals who are filling those roles today, right? So like, you know, my wallet might be like, okay, whoever owns it, just like don't fish, and that's cool with me. You know,
We should,
where
be,
like,
we should be able to shut it down if they're abusive, but we shouldn't be able to take it from them.
sure,
We haven't-
yeah, and I agree with you, but that's not. But I would think that, like,
There's
from my
others
point of view, you
that
should be able to
don't
raise, to bring a dispute, which may end up it's not you taking it from them. It's like according to the rules of the institution, it's rightfully transferred, right?
Yes. Can I make a proposal that because takedowns are solvable outside of the ENS system,
I think that,
that we should potentially ignore them for this conversation
I think
because because they can be solved without the need for any change to ENS.
Yeah.
They can be solved with an ad blocking layer with a
so I think that for the purpose of this discussion, we should just talk about like not takedowns, because I think it's a more well discussion and I think it'll inform any takedown decision we make. But secondly, I think that if the ENS decides that it's not the ENS's responsibility to do takedowns, that it is the ENS's responsibility to incentivize someone to do it, because I don't want to have a repo with the word blacklist in it, and I currently have 3. Okay, like I don't want that responsibility either. You know, so like I don't know if there's someone out there that does want that responsibility.
So
That should be another answer.
Do you want it, Dan? You know, like I would not, like I really put this off for a long time, you know, yeah, I mean, it was basically Coindash that like forced us to have this like.
We're crypto, we should be able to, I mean, the thing is like, you should
If
have the
people want
freedom
to
to
send shit at us, we should be able to, but I can't because then they would $7 million, you know, and then I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm the protector.
As much as I'll throw in though, the concept of a clearinghouse, I'm not happy with how it was implemented in the legacy DNS world, but there's a couple of trademark clearinghouses, especially when all those new TLDs came out, with 1,400 of them rolled out in 3 years, it was just insane. And so what you could do, trademark holders were encouraged to register their trademarks into the clearinghouse. They got gouged on those to do it. It wasn't very effective, but in reality, the way it was supposed, I mean, not in reality, in theory, how it was supposed to work is when you were starting to register a name that collided with something in the clearinghouse, you could have the name, but you had to acknowledge that the IP owner's rights existed to that term and that your use of that name was not going to infringe on their intellectual property. Like I registered a domain called Plan B Works, right, for DNS, backup DNS, and there's Plan B, birth control pill. So it's like you can't, if you're gonna register this name, just don't put out a birth control pill and you can use it. Right? Or if I pretended to be Plan B, then I'd be in violation of my own registering agreement, and then it's an open and shut case. So there's that concept. And the only other thing I'll say is it's known and it's in practice most of the time that if you register Facebook.eth or Facebook.net and your registration date is prior to Facebook's trademark, then no matter what you're doing, they can't take it from you, provided you're not, doing a social network or doing the same thing as them. So I mean that's very well understood and upheld in numerous cases in the legacy DNS space.
I think there should also be some discussion around how automated this process should be, because while a lot of that sounds good, I don't see that being very scalable or more efficient than the existing system. I mean, even if you delegate to some organization that decides how valid this claim is, it seems like you do still need the root key holders to or at least a smart contract that would somehow listen to those oracles to end up actually reassigning or blacklisting. So there probably should be some kind of discussion on how automated it could be, or how automated we should make it go to be.
That's the next session.
I see.
And then there was one thing, what about if someone loses the keys to a certain name? If that happens a lot, and over time it will, of course, then the whole ENS system consists of many names which are unreachable. So should there be some dispute process to rescue
So,
How do we know it's not just being not used? Right?
Well, yeah, that's a dilemma, of course.
if nothing else, I think that personally, I think it's likely that the ENS registrar will have some form of renewal system, whether that requires fee payment or not. And so ultimately, if you lose the keys, eventually the name will be returned to the pool of available addresses because you didn't renew it correctly.
Okay,
Which
what
means
if
that if you forget to renew,
yeah, or what?
You can like
what if
5
you have
years, so it's like a long time.
It could be the same dispute process.
Yeah, but what you have a willing seller? Suppose as a seller, you could say, I'm going to throw away the keys if you don't pay what I want. You could always renew the process, and then, for example, Google can never have their own name because the seller is unwilling to negotiate. They simply want the name Google is owned by Microsoft, for example. They simply want Google to prevent to use their name. That should be some kind of dispute process for that. That if the seller is unresponsive in some way, or perhaps the seller has lost keys or is dead or whatever, then the name should go to anyone or should be auctioned off again.
But I think that's,
They will do that, right?
I think.
If you expire, you won't renew it because you're dead.
So,
Well,
so I'd
what
like to
if
point
someone
out
does
something that we
take
talked
the
about
renewal fees?
To do
earlier.
that, they need the keys.
Yeah, because he isn't that. He does pay the renewal fees, but simply prevents the trademark owner to use that name.
So
That's having a dispute resolution process.
I'd like to make a case for not needing a dispute resolution process for reassigning. And my reasoning there is that in our current domain name system, the thing after the top level domain matters a lot. But in the ENS system, subdomains actually matter. Whereas in the current domain name system, subdomains are all just one big thing under the main domain name. And it's not a good idea to build your brand on a subdomain. But in the ENS system, people will build their brands on subdomains.
I don't think they will. I think it's very much like now where you can have myname.blogspot.com for your blog.
No,
And
but
if you're more dedicated, you can
But
build it
it's
by your own
not
name.
out of the question for Blogspot to then set up their top level domain so that all it takes is one subdomain holder to keep the rules in place, which are that the subdomain holders own their domain outright and can continue to keep the main domain name renewed. Like that is a very valid,
Oh yeah, so the main contract holder's gone, the subdomain holders could
the
still.
owners of Blogspot can give up their control to ever revoke the subdomain.
Oh, yeah, no,
And in that world, augur.company can be the brand that you build your name. Augur.company.eth can be the brand that you build your name under. And I think that's going to happen. Like that's going to be a real thing that happens. Whereas right now you don't build your brand under your Tumblr account. I mean, some people do, but big brands, but big brands don't do that because why would you subject yourselves to whatever Tumblr is going to do with your domain name?
But I don't
And so in that world where subdomains matter, where subdomains have real value, there will be subdomains of top level domain of whatever. There will be subdomains that like namespaces of subdomains that really matter. And in that world, the amount of brand namespace in the very top tier is much bigger than in the current domain name system. Which might mean that the need to that Microsoft.eth and Microsoft.company.eth are no longer on two very different tiers. In the current internet, those are on two very different tiers. But in ENS, they're a lot closer to, they might be a lot closer together.
I don't agree with the assertion that that's the reason people don't use subdomains on the internet. I think very few people do avoid that because they're concerned about, control of their domain, and mostly people do it because it looks bad. Yeah, it's going to look just as bad.
There's more characters. There's an extra period.
Yeah.
Okay, but we've been talking about knocking the .eth off in the first place. At which point, now you're just talking about MetaMask.company. And from a user perspective, that looks the same.
So, personally, I don't agree with the idea of knocking off the TLD, but even if we did, wouldn't just MetaMask be better?
Okay,
but you still have the governance issues of what's governing your super domain and what happens if your super domain goes away, or what happens if your keys are lost or whatever. No matter what level or how many dots there are, you always have to look at the domain above you.
And so the case that I made is that with smart contracts, you can know that the domain above you, which is just under .eth, is owned by a contract, and that you have the power to renew it. So it can't just
your subdomain or your super domain.
Super domain. Yeah. You can set it up so that your super domain is renewable by all of the subdomain holders, or by anybody.
Or you could chip in towards its renewal fee or something.
Sure. So anyways, I'm not saying that I know the future and that that's what it's going to be, but it's kind of what I hope it is.
Well, I think it's a necessary condition for a lot of people to use subdomains. Like in the long run, you need to be able to have some assurance that the person who owns gimmeve.eth isn't going to literally gimme all the ETH.
Okay, so we've said that maybe blocking domains is something we can push out. We kind of have felt a little bit that like any system with subjectivity can maybe help, will have some risks or some abuse modes that will maybe can help us do some things that will improve the quality of name registrations, like the Google going to Microsoft, Google instead of Microsoft, like disputes. But most of the abuse maybe was stopped by the blacklisting only.
I mean, personally, I agree that I think there's only really one category of abuse that I can think of that isn't stopped by blacklisting, which is denial of service, like deliberately taking a name so the other person can't use it. And arguably, you can even make that more difficult or more unprofitable by you suspend the name and then you tell them that they back and they transfer.
And so I guess really what we're talking about at the end of the day then is swatting, right? Yeah. It's because it's not just denial of using, it's like denial unless you pay me, right? It's kind of like can't use it unless 1,000 ETH, right?
It's called a bad faith registration.
Bad faith registration, yeah.
That's the absolutely essential component to win a dispute. Bad faith.
It's bad faith.
As I understand it,
is bad faith they want to resell it?
Bad faith is confusingly similar, knowingly intending to profit from its resale, or exactly what you mean, like getting this where the other guy can't.
As I understand it, though, this really only applies when the complainant has an IP right. So I could buy ilovedogs.com for the sole purpose of reselling to somebody who loves dogs. And
that's
that would
not
be
a bad
fine.
faith. Yeah.
But if I Love Dogs was a well-known internet business, then that would now be bad faith because they could claim ownership.
And what's not bad faith is, and people claim it is demanding a lot of money for your domain. Oh, he tried to sell it to me for $1 million. That's not
Were they using it, or were they holding it, not using it? Does it matter?
It doesn't matter.
No, interesting. So, but if they registered it knowing that you were going to buy it from you,
That's bad
then if they registered thinking that someone would probably later have a business.
Okay, but that's not bad faith.
Right. So this is what I'm trying to see.
Yeah, registering a domain in the hopes of selling it for a lot of money later is not bad.
Unless you know particularly exactly who the victim is.
Yeah.
Well, so like all
and
of
you
these,
know that they have pre-existing rights. Like
Pre-existing
Google,
rights.
yeah, Google.info, or Google.co, like .co.
For trademark and IP resolution, is there any reason why we could not say the .eth will be bound by UDRP results and just let them do it?
Well, there's no them for UDRP, it's a policy, it's not an entity.
But following the process in the
You
same way
can
as
say
the
we're gonna
domain.
follow the same process.
We can say you both want that domain, go follow that process, give us a result and we'll abide by it.
Well, we would probably actually put into smart contracts the steps of that process.
And the only thing you have to plug in are your dispute resolution providers.
Yeah.
So it's like right now, it's like WIPO, National Arbitration Forum. There's one in Europe. There's one in Asia. I can't remember the names.
Could they do it?
If they want to, right? Like you can't just put them in and then someone goes to them talking about Ethereum and they're like, who are you and what
But
is
they're not.
Ethereum?
Okay.
I think the
Certainly we need to talk to them. I mean, like I said, these guys have got a process, they've got a policy, they spent years doing this stuff. And we're trying to make it up again in the afternoon, it seems like.
So I mean, I think that the best option there would be you go to each of these dispute providers and you say, we'd like you to consider resolving disputes with Ethereum. If so, then here's a key there, and you can sign the results of disputes with that key.
That's the other thing is I think you might be better served going to the Ethereum community and looking for just like no one exists right now, but who would be interested in forming a dispute resolution provider? I know I'd be interested.
But is there a reason why we would need an Ethereum specialist? We're talking about trademark and IP.
There's gonna be more willing, that's all.
Yeah.
More willing.
Really? I mean, they get paid $5,000 for it.
I was gonna say,
Like, I hope not, like, I hope we have a system that's way more scalable, way lower cost than the current existing dispute resolution.
Right.
We're
That's
talking
the
about
other
how
thing is like, do you want
frequently the disputes happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to have it be 10 or 100x cheaper, to have 10 or 100x more.
But then then somebody who has that vision can develop their own dispute resolution.
Right.
That could be one of the options.
Sure, yeah. I just don't think they have hard coding the dispute resolution providers. That's what I'm saying.
Not so much hard coding them as approving them and adding them. So
Yeah,
if
that's
somebody
pretty
else
much.
follows the process. You can do
Yeah.
that.
So why don't we just why don't we just have like the process and have like the people who and have a process for selecting I agree.
Of course, this still only addresses the UDRP, not
They
the
should have someone in the organization who run GEF.
Well, not even that. They can use my Ether wallet.
Yeah.
So through this conversation, I started in a really undecided place because I didn't know, and I have landed in the camp that I do not think that we should have a dispute system for relocating names. I think it goes, this is sort of an ideological thing. The other ones are preventing harm to bodies of people, to the public,
to third parties who aren't
to innocent third parties, that sort of thing. And I'm all about fixing those situations because you are doing it's largely like a pure. It's an objective good in my mind.
Actually, that gets so subjective.
No, I'm not saying. What I'm saying is, and then also that we can solve those with a layer above. So the choice to participate in that system is on the user. So nobody's being forced to blacklist anybody. Okay, so that's why I've landed in the camp that I'm okay with us not having a dispute system here. And the reason that I don't want one for trademark IP is because now we're talking about two parties. And while there's a bunch of legitimate cases, a whole lot of the philosophy behind this was that governments wouldn't be able to censor individuals, and that people with a lot of power would not be able to use that power to hurt people with just a little bit of power. And I cannot imagine us coming up with a dispute system that didn't allow the powerful a lot of power over the not powerful. And in that model, if if that's true, which in my mind it is, then we shouldn't have one in the first place.
I mean, there's countless examples of gigantic corporations trying to challenge just normal mom and pops over a domain name that losing all the time, like reverse takeover attempts. So I don't think the current system gives preferential treatment to gigantic corporations just at the IP level dispute thing.
And actually, I think smart contracts are uniquely positioned to provide a lot of procedural fairness, right? Where the procedure is the same for everyone.
So what about and I hate bringing up edge cases, but I'm not sure that this is an edge case. ENS registrations are completely anonymous. Okay, they're completely pseudo-anonymous. How am I supposed to, what if I just don't notice that somebody's disputing my name? There's no way for them to contact me, and I should not be required to register a way for them to link that domain name to me. And so if there's a dispute system, now, if you want to not have your name taken away from you, you have to participate in some system that lets them.
If you want to have the best defense possible, and the system allows you to appoint your own arbiters, but if, say, the arbiters aren't appointed by you, then you don't actually necessarily even need to be notified. You just open the door to the conversation.
But then it's not arbitration if one side doesn't show up at the table.
You only have to be contactable. You don't have to be identifiable.
Yeah, but you have to be you have to be paying attention. That's not.
Only if you need to provide evidence or choose arbiters.
You'll have to at some point, if someone decides to, if anybody decides to dispute a name that you own, you have to be able to be contacted, or else the dispute will be handled without you.
Right, but I don't see how being contactable is an undue burden.
Well, because in every dispute, because we've determined that these are subjective, there will be evidence from both sides. Sometimes it'll be black and white, sometimes it won't be. And if I'm not there arguing my side of the dispute, and then that means going and pushing a button that is whatever the rules that we've discussed or decided there is good, and it's 1, 2, 3. I'm not there to pick that 3. I get screwed just because of the fact that I wasn't paying attention.
Right, but I don't see how being contactable is an undue burden.
The other thing is
because I deeded a very valuable domain name to my kid and I'm dead. And the
anonymous and being contactable are. I mean, that's the thing. You're just make an email address. Okay, so make an email address, now you can contact me. Except that I keep track of that email address. I have to go check that email address forever and ever and ever.
I agree that I'm now reaching for why these things here are the edge cases in which these fail, but those edge cases are why I like this.
I'll tell you this though, if there's any thought that someday .eth will be included in the legacy IANA group, we will have to have a dispute resolution system, we will have to have an IP intellectual property framework, and we will have to have a WHOIS system, even if you've got anonymity built on top of it. Those 3 things are must-haves.
So somehow I bought with that, even me, right? Even me, I'm kind of on the radical dispute resolution side. The WHOIS, I think, is a disaster. It's just waiting, begging for abuse.
Everybody knows WHOIS is a disaster.
And it's something that I would never wish on the
So on the day that I'm weighing those 2 decisions side by side, then I'll reevaluate it. But right now, I'm not trading one for the other.
But I still think that contactable versus identifiable it's a red herring. There's 2 separate issues there, and you don't have to be identifiable to respond to
it. Really, you're not talking about establishing a channel. You're talking about providing notice, receiving notice, right? But I hear you. It is a burden to have to receive notice, right? But the question is really what are our goals for the ENS? And what is the best way to reach them, right? And if the goal is to give people as few obligations as possible, while also preventing harm, then I'm kind of more or less in line with you, right? But if the goal is to provide the best possible name registrations, then I think that definitely we need to have this kind of dispute resolution that will change the way things resolve. Another thing is that somehow you said that the users can decide client side to stop the abuse. I also highly suspect that my users are abusers, right? I don't think that they are necessarily well-intentioned, right? And if they want to get to use the name registry to access some thing, and we're just doing a client-side decision, then they're gonna choose the filter that doesn't block that out, right? And so there's an extent to which there are harms that we could be preventing with something in the protocol that we won't be preventing with just client-side filters.
Well, and I would say that we do have that. We have the key filters. For the things that rise above that are really that serious, that's my.
Yeah, but does it scale? Does that scale?
Yeah, and there's the 1,000 little phishing sites that none of them are individually worth escalating to that level, but certain people are unprotected from because you have this system that only some people subscribe to.
And I thought the whole idea was we're going to get rid of that thing.
That is a long-term goal, yes.
Yeah, sure. I have two suggestions. Sorry. Yeah, the one thing is I only understand in by local language, so it's difficult to explain. But the first thing is we can view ENS name as a non-creative commons properties. Yeah, it's one view of property view. And one of property view, but there is a good governance rules for creative properties already with Creative Commons, right? And we are now talking about non-creative properties, right? Online properties. So we may follow the way that Creative Commons using for the creative property into the ENS name.
So what would the upshot of that be in practical terms? How would that affect how we govern a registry?
Yeah, well, and I think there is some prerequisite before getting into the dispute resolution. I think, and that's the second thing. And I run a row system, especially on the intellectual properties for 2-3 years to become a patent lawyer kind of thing, but I turned down to become it. But it's very simple. But and I run that the system. Usually we resolve the conflicts on the law or rules with the universal system consists of the constitution and civil law and criminal law, right? And on the Ethereum, we do not have rules to punish. Well, and there are two kinds of rules for punishment. To put punishment is criminal law, and to resolve the conflict between people is civil law, right? And we can form some system or direct discussion with that kind of thinking, or I believe that the universal system on every community in the world. So, and for the dispute kind of thing, fishing dispute kind of thing, first we have to have a law kind of thing. If law kind of criminal law kind of thing, we have to define that. And the organization judge on it, right? To put punishment over that. And for the the civil kind of code. And on the other hand, the large corporation and individual fighting case on the same name, we put some civil, we assign some organization to arbitration, arbitration organization, right? So there are two kind of things, basically universal in the law system. So, and we can follow that kind of system on the Ethereum or and ENS, I believe. So
they can or can't?
Well,
can,
yeah. We can. That and well, we have two good, teachers. Right, one is Creative Commons, and the other is universal law system, right?
Yeah. I mean, I personally found that studying like the justice system, the
Yeah.
way the courts work,
Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot about like dispute resolution. Disputes actually like I've taken quite a bit of inspiration for Oracle design systems from those types of systems. It's really interesting, right? Precedents are interesting, like the whole like institution of the judge is this thing that's supposed to be impartial and determine the truth or serve justice or equity, and the institution evolved in a very adversarial setting around a lot of the same concerns that we have now about things being abused by the powerful, right? And there's like principles that these institutions are meant to be based around, that are meant to like protect people and make sure that everyone, goes through the process fairly, everyone is represented, the law applies to everyone, these types of things, right?
Yeah, but those are some things optional.
Sorry?
I would argue that while it's probably a lot better than it used to be, it certainly still favors the rich and powerful.
Hey, I didn't end up here by not having any cyberpunk in me.
So you raised this point earlier about your concern with dispute resolution systems, and I'd argue that there's a lot of precedent you can look at with the UDRP and with the existing domain disputes process and abuse process. So if there is rampant abuse by people with more power against those,
I'm not looking about rampant abuse.
Well, okay.
I'm talking
If it is a significant concern, then there should be plenty of precedent to back that up.
So, the reason, so I am a huge proponent of darknet markets. I think they're great, as long as you're not selling assassinations and things like that. But selling drugs on the internet, I'm fine with it. But you can't have one of those on a normal domain name because it will get taken down by whatever central authority that domain is. And
so when you talk about power differentials, you're talking about the state versus an individual, not a rich person versus a less rich person.
I'm talking about both, but state versus individual is
It's the same. It's very similar argument because generally when someone's so affluent that they have so much money that they have power over someone, they have power over that person until they get the government, because then the government does. That's the addition to power.
But I would challenge you to find a precedent for that in the existing domain name system, where somebody, just by virtue of having lots of money, took a name off someone.
So there's a guy that recently.
When we won the UDRP, and then they sued him for such a huge amount of money that he crapped his pants and gave him the name.
But it's not gonna happen that the judge writes, this guy had more money, therefore I'm granting.
That's pretty well what happened, because we actually won the UDRP. We took them through UDRP, we won, and then they sued him, and then when we went to see lawyers, they said it's gonna cost them a minimum $25,000 just to respond.
So a relevant comment from someone watching the YouTube stream. He points out UDRP provides the appeal to a court of competent jurisdiction.
URS does, UDRP doesn't. URS, court, yes.
Yes.
Court, sorry.
So You can resolve a UDRP resolution and then still they can take it to court as an escalation or an appeal. And that can be difficult to determine when your registrants are anonymous. Like, it can be difficult to determine jurisdiction. I was pretty sure the UDRP made a provision as well when I was glancing through it the other day.
I also heard that you can appeal the dispute resolution process in the Lanai hand to courts in your jurisdiction.
He also points out
that
with the process.
No, it's not the
he also points out that UDRP is generally focused on second level names, and here we have the issue that what if a dispute on a second level name took it away and therefore violated the promises of that to its sub-registrants. So Gibby.eth gets seized and now all of their subdomains are invalid.
What we were talking about earlier, then your super domain and all your domains above you are
So you can make a contractual promise that as owner of that domain, but that promise can be violated by the disputes process taking your name away.
Well, I mean, that promise is never violated according to smart contract. But in practice,
The
it doesn't
expectations
resolve,
of
right?
users.
Yeah.
I mean, for reasons like that, I'm increasingly personally in favour of a system that permits integrated dispute resolution, but the only remedy is blacklisting a domain internal to the system, so it can no longer be used to assign resolvers.
Or maybe you can have a system where there's like dispute resolution that every subdomain has to inherit. And so that way you can go and actually, like, if the issue is not every subdomain, and only some of them, the dispute resolution can address it in more fine grained.
I find that problematic because you can end up with somebody owning a domain but only being able to control some of the subdomains, which, you know, from the system level point of view, which hugely complicates designing the system.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Currently, the ENS registry is about 30 lines long and 2 main comments, and I'd like to keep it simple if we can. But I going back to the external dispute resolution, I personally see little value in building a dispute resolution system as a separate layer on top. I think it could come in harm when there's disagreement about who uses it, and I think there's very few cases in which it's more valuable because, you know, people talk about disagreement over results of dispute resolution, but if your only outcome is blacklisting, then I think that is far rarer than most people would assume. You know, the most common example would perhaps be, you know, the Pirate Bay.org being shut down, that sort of thing. And I agree it's not ideal, but I think it causes more harm to have different views of which names are safe than it does to, you know, to permit the occasional, we would really like to keep this, but it turns out it's illegal sort of thing, personally.
Yeah, I have very simple dispute resolution system definition. Yeah, if the case is in some domain, yeah, we at the commission or committee will follow the rule of the domain. If the case is not belongs to particular domain, there is no rule, so we cannot well, just not justify. Well, we cannot we cannot do anything on there.
So you're talking about each TLD having its own dispute resolution rules, or are you talking about
Something maybe. Basically, my understanding is that the dispute resolution has a kind of a restricted jurisdiction to the domain and subdomains.
Oh. Is it only if there's a .uk or .jp or something?
If dispute resolution is opt-in, then we might as well not have it.
Yes, exactly.
I don't know. I would opt in. Yeah, especially if you're planning on hosting a registry yourself in ENS, right? Like one of these lower level ones.
Because I would want to assert my rights.
Yeah,
I mean,
the country.
But an opt-in dispute resolution system is built separate from ENS because an opt-in dispute resolution system is giving your domain the ability to change things away to some other organization. So
why would you choose to do that?
And that's what I'm saying.
You're right now
you
that
might choose to do that
on
if
the other
you're
side is not.
doing it.
I would say I'm
doing
excited. I would So I would register under a TLD that had a dispute resolution system rather than you know, I'm not even gonna try to assert my rights under one that has no dispute resolution because it's the Wild West out there, you know?
That's like that's literally my philosophy on the ENS, sorry to say.
Which is
It's Wild West out there. I can't be risking my life.
But do you want it to stay that way, or do you want it to eventually become like an important component of?
No, I mean, I would prefer, I basically want to have like something that like prevents abuse of users and third parties, something that is fair between registrants, and something that is like scalable and efficient at increasing the value provided to users. And so it's like, those are really the three kind of main things. And somehow I don't see that happening really to the fullest extent as possible without dispute resolution.
Something that falls short of that is worse.
What do you mean?
Well, I want those three things too. And if somebody in here could convince me that we could get those three things, then I'd be totally on board. But I'm reasonably convinced that we can. And if we can't get them, I think it's better to not have a system.
So I think in theory we can't, within some trust models, but I think that in practice.
I think we can eventually. I do not think we can now or in the near-term future.
Okay.
I think that there are a lot
Too many
of
research
projects. I think there are a lot of projects going on being built in the system right now that are going to facilitate this stuff being built, but we're probably a year or 2 years or 3 years out because those things need to mature, at which point we may be able to set up something that matches that model.
Does anybody remember the digital currencies from like Lily Mods, like Liberty Reserve, Eagle, Liberty Reserve, Gold Money, Unix? I mean, it kind of rhymes with that era because Eagle had zero governance structure. And even before they were taken offline, they ate themselves. It was just so corrupt, and it was all Ponzi's and hypes, and it's like, you saw Eagle, and you knew right away it was just a scam. Whereas Gold Money kind of went the other direction. They had a super rigid governance structure, and it was too cumbersome. Like, they got no traction, they got no velocity in the space, and nobody was using them. They're still around now. Now they're Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is the company that bought Gold Money, but it's like you can go with the no governance, or you can go with too much governance, and we've seen it before. When you look at that space, and then where do we land in the middle of that?
And the reserve is in the middle.
So the reserve got shut down.
I mean, Bitcoin is still around, and they're actually getting more big scale investors right now. So like they're actually Bitcoin.
Yeah,
So like that company actually did turn around and do fairly successful.
And they're starting to get but they never actually made it in those days as a payment like transactional thing. It was like store of value.
Yeah, I think Goldman Sachs just bought a bunch to put in their biggest portfolios.
Really? Yeah.
That was a good investment.
Can we write a list of questions and get answer, add some structure to the discussion?
I'm going to suggest a short 15-minute toilet break and so forth, and then we can reconvene afterwards, do that, and hopefully maybe start talking about technical aspects of how any of these systems might work if we can agree that they're a good idea.
It sounds like Pepper was saying, it would be nice if it could be true, but I don't think it's so, right? It's like too good to be true.
Yeah, if you could set up a system that was like unbiased to everybody and like, it's just not possible. Like we're just purely based on the fact that we're this room of like 20, 30 people talking about it means that it's going to be biased.
We got it.
Doesn't it come back to that my proposal should be better focus on just doing practice and reporting rather than just doing distribution? It sounds like, like you said, it's too hard. What's better to find out? This will actually happen. What was and what happened? I think we still have to use case studies to
just discussion.
I'm not sure that I think we're going to file disputes if the disputes
Yeah, so if you create a repository, then anyone can build something on top of it. But I think it's too early to make a blacklist or take it away. Any solution is to ask, as long as there is something still out there, if people really care, they can have for example, it comes down to wallet. It comes down to wallet and like users can actually integrate. If that becomes, it's a thing like the blacklist listing. As long as it's it's up to whoever but if there's no list, you don't know.
So you're suggesting starting off by building the dispute system as a second layer, and then
just have that data. Yeah. And what to do is like I think we need to
suggested
I'm actually more keen on using the auction system for other purposes. Like auction system, because you're thinking about taking off the auction system because no use for ENS. But I think it's great use for other purposes such as browsers.
I like the idea of using what we learned from it to build a platform that can be used for things.
And also that I think has a effect to bring more adoption for the ENS, because if you support ENS, it also supports like auction-based browser, and that's browser.
The options, and it would be a good abstraction anyway, separating out how domains are allocated and how they're managed. Sell a domain plugin that you can reassign to any contract you want without even register.
You have like doc stuff built in, and everything in context is like you're kind of have a guarantee that it's moving and you can build on it.
You can see what
there's a different level or
you start looking like
I can hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm gonna try to declare a system.
I have all this. It's funny because like after that discussion, like I'm much more uncertain. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that even in the most extreme version of where we said, you know, we got to somehow. When you want to judge something, you don't get paid for it. So even if we have that, right, I don't think the person would complain. Unless there was a lot of like, they should probably be paid. Any kind of process,
So the other thing that I'm thinking about the most
Not really.
So they have it's been out there in the world for many years now. It's amazing the time when people have
It's still just facilitating front page.
That's a great idea. Yeah, but like now, like we've now we've got but now we've actually got some finally. So
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
So I was kind of curious about okay, I guess how I view it
It's just a whole Yeah, like during wild and
I don't know. I have looked
This has nothing to do with my still get there are ICO terms and what do
We have small word things.
Ladies and gentlemen, please resume your seats. I need a translate. You should have paused it when you got up. Energy saving.
All right. I can do that.
I definitely like I had a lot of
yeah.
But
yes, I mean, that's the exciting that there's some
You can hear the sound of my voice clap twice. And the floor over this guy.
And we just learned that some people can't count to two.
Or do you start from zero? Wait, who is this?
Some people play it 3 times.
Oh, really? You start from zero. That's the first.
So preliminarily, this afternoon session is for talking about how we can actually implement dispute resolution in a technical fashion. To some degree, I think that's independent of what a dispute is. And the technical system doesn't care why you decided that a name should, become someone else's or stop resolving. It just cares that you're telling it to. But of course, the two aren't completely independent. And I think a good example we came up with earlier was, should we have a dispute system that only permits blacklisting names and doesn't permit anything else? And of course, should we have one at all, or should it be built as an upper layer? So I think it's probably healthy to not try and tell everyone to shut up about the former stuff and maybe mix it in a bit, but try and keep it a bit coherent. I think you suggested listing up a bunch of open questions we had. And also Makoto had an interesting idea that he brought to me, and I suggested he relay to all the rest of you. So over to you first.
Yeah, I think
no pressure.
That's based on some of the comment I made earlier, but I think it's still no consensus that it's still too early to provide a solution. So maybe the focus would be tracking what kind of resolution exists rather than resolving. Because I think you said it's too early right now, probably 1 or 2 years ahead. So then currently the best is to gather what kind of dispute exists right now.
Meaning like outside of the blockchain?
No, now. So there's already people own the dispute, right? Names, right? And I wanted to pay for a float party.if, but I'll pay on my dispute. So if that's the case, why do I think I need a dispute system? So just gathering more information.
But I thought
I don't own Vladzenko.eth, and that's very real.
Yeah.
Right? And I totally would love to bring a dispute to this guy. What do you actually?
Who here owns Vladzenko.eth?
I know blood smiley face, smiley face, smiley face. I can give you something that blood.
So I thought the other point that Makoto was getting at was, or maybe I'm just extrapolating, was what about starting a system as a off-chain dispute resolution system where the stakes are low, effectively, building a proper dispute resolution system for blacklisting names around that, and experimenting and building on that, and then reassessing whether that should be integrated as a base level component. I'm still very much of the opinion that I think that in the long run at least, second layer dispute systems are flawed, but I think they're a lot better than no dispute system, and they could well be a good stepping stone to a more permanent one. Is that a fair characterization?
So one of the things that when we were chatting, we came up with, which is again a very half-formed idea, but if the fundamental reason for ENS, as we talk about this, is getting the market value of names, and there is a dispute on a name, then the idea was to allow the current owner of the name to re-auction it with any difference in price between what is currently locked in as ETH and what the final auction price is to go to the current owner. The idea of this would be to allow someone to reevaluate the name if they wanted. I'm saying if you had Facebook.eth and you decided you did want to let it go, you can re-auction it. And whatever that final price comes in at, the new owner picks it up and the current owner gets some money.
I mean, you can do that at present without any changes to the system at all.
You can. With an external contract.
With an external auction.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that does anything other than make it easier to profit off squatting on a trademark name.
It's true, but then again, like we said, that comes back to if we're looking at if someone has got in under the expected value of a name, then the value of that name should rise somehow with some mechanism to meet whatever the market expects it should be.
Yeah, so I hope there's not a disagreement, a confusion about what I meant by marketing. I mean marketing is advertising, not about market prices, right? But we haven't really talked about like the efficiency of name allocations in terms of like the highest bidder. Is that something that you're basically coming from? You think the highest bidder should have a name?
Yes, and the reality is I would say a bid auction should do that, but the problem has been that, Facebook.com were not aware that Ethereum existed and even what Ethereum name service existed in any meaningful form at the time. There should be some way of resetting that. But obviously, back to having no surprises. It should only be the owner of the domain that can kick that off. Now, this doesn't solve, like we say, a direct trademark or IP dispute, but it does allow some of that name squatting area to be resolved in a less confrontational way than having to do dispute resolution.
Yeah, so basically you're saying like, let's not do dispute resolution, let's just allow people to auction their names off. Which they can't already do.
If I understand, it's forced, it's essentially a forced auction.
No, we can't force it. That wouldn't be fair because then everyone could force. You know, that really goes like you lose established names that way.
Well, then we just already have that system.
We do have something like that, yes, but not inside the ENS. It's not internal to the ENS.
Sure. Oh, I'd argue that building just as a feature into ENS is just a bad idea because it's just complexity. Like throughout all of the complexity that we don't absolutely have to have. It's generally.
I'm inclined to agree personally.
I don't know.
I don't necessarily.
I'd be okay with coming up with a like sanctioned like this is the like auction
aftermarket methodology or something.
Yeah, it's on top of it. Like I'd be comfy with that, but just not as like a core piece.
Okay.
Also worth doing, Vlad suggested, asked for a poll, straw poll on who thought we should have a dispute system. It'd be interesting to see if that's changed now.
Okay.
So the original question, if I recall, was who believes that names should be only handled by objective economic methods? All in favour?
Yeah. So, and this doesn't preclude, in my opinion, client-side filters, right? So if you believe ENS being economic only and then having client-side filters, then I say like also whatever.
Makes good. Oh, wow.
And these economic things cannot include dispute resolution.
No. So basically, economic things are objective, right? Objective economic.
You get incentivized to review.
That doesn't change the subjective nature of the information, right?
Right.
Objective,
right. Okay.
So try again. All in favour of that proposal?
So this is saying no to a dispute.
No to any kind of dispute resolution process in ENS. There could be extra protocol, another layer, just not in ENS. So
one more time.
We're saying we do not put that in here. If I raise my hand,
You see, no dispute resolution in ENS of any kind, like no.
Like I want to own it and notice so. I think I might say that right.
But hang on.
I
do realize this includes what you were talking about there.
No, because what I'm talking about is above the ENS.
He's talking about agreement.
Yeah. Or at least that's my understanding of the question.
So not a result I expect.
No, me neither.
1 from 5.
But I think it has to do with this question of this fact that we've discovered that we're kind of more comfortable with blacklisting as a client side thing.
I just, once again, I still think that's a terrible idea.
I don't think it's terrible. I mean, I think if we're going to have an objective economic thing, then there's nothing we can do other than that, and therefore becomes our only fallback, right? Other than hard forks.
So I've often seen this thing called a separation between mechanism and policy. So the often question is, should the RM command, if you have a file that says do not delete me, if you do RM on that file, should it not delete it? So often the claim is that you have this mechanism that does exactly that, and then the policy is sort of a wrapper around it. So I'm inclined to say that ENS should just be the mechanism. If you want to have a policy wrapped around it, that's a separate issue.
But if your policy is never affect the objective resolution of names, then why have the mechanism?
Well, so I mean, because like, if you can formalize rules and put them in a smart contract, it's harder for people to change the process to turn out in a different way. If you just have a policy, so basically, one way to think about it is in terms of the level of in terms of like institutions, there's like rules that are specified and formal, and then there's like a system for enforcing them, and then there's all the other stuff that goes into like kind of the norms and culture around actually making the system run.
But what I was saying is, Virgil basically said, should RM enforce policies on what files can be removed? And arguably no. But my question is, if the policy is no file should ever be removed, should you even have an RM tool? Why build a system for resolving disputes if there are things that shouldn't be one?
The decision, I want to be clear that the decision we're not making a forever decision today.
No.
So we're talking I think it's good to frame your mental context around, should we start doing something in the next few months about this? And that's sort of there's another talk about where should we go eventually? And we've talked about that some too.
And Makoto's suggestion is explicitly that. Why don't we build a second layer dispute resolution system as if we were building a first layer dispute resolution system and see how it goes, basically. And then if it works, import it. As I say, I'm quite opposed to second layer dispute resolution, but I quite like that as a way to handle it.
I assume then it's non-binding and non-enforceable.
Well, the idea is that it's binding on anyone. It's only binding on anyone who agrees to use that blacklist. It's like a standard blacklist. You have this process for adding to it, that is just as.
So with the blacklist being not for
So imagine we have a system for governing ENS, and we don't want to deploy that because we're nervous. First, use that same system to govern a blacklist.
Yeah.
And then, if that works out okay for people using that blacklist, then maybe one day,
Currently, to be honest, if MetaMask and my wallet and the EtherScan takes the blacklist, it covers pretty much majority anyway. I'm still nothing.
I'd like to actually hear from Dan and what.
We already have, we don't call it a blacklist, we call it a dark list. Because we don't actually, one, I hate the word blacklist, and two, it should be reserved for really blacklisting things. We don't blacklist things at this point, we just warn you.
Shame.
In Tor, we call them a
You actually
blacklist and
block
an allow list.
Yeah, and then for EAL, we call it the blacklist. So in the ether address lookup Chrome extension that we have, that's, it's not like my wallet specifically, it's actually run by this guy, Harry4098, she's a little freaking genius. That's a blacklist, because literally, if you have that Chrome extension installed, you literally cannot go to a URL that's on the blacklist.
Yeah.
But in the repo, we have it's called the Ethereum list repo. It's under Mighty Wall if you want to find it. We have dark lists and light lists for URLs, ENS names, addresses, and then and our tokens are in there right now as well, just because it's a repo of lists.
Yeah, MetaMask pulls in the 409H Ethereum address with a blacklist, and we just do the same thing. We show a big red scary screen that says this is blacklisted because it's suspected to be a phishing site. You go here to file a dispute, otherwise you can disable it if you want to visit that site. We actually need to disable it since you have to proceed.
Yeah, we give you the option, and if you want to screw yourself, you can. It's just a little bit harder.
You're forced to notice it.
Yeah.
What if you created a contract, I don't know if you need terminology, that for a domain that doesn't have to be called by the owner of the domain, that could be open a dispute resolution process or log a dispute about this domain, just gather some basic info on what basis you're disputing it, goes somewhere. Basically, start collating that and see what it looks like.
So my own thoughts on that are that if there's no promise of any sort of even vague resolution, most people probably won't bother filling it out, unless they're really pissed off. The guy who lost one of the wallet providers, I can't remember who it was, lost his name just to a squatter, and he's so pissed off he's calling for us to reset the entirety of the mess. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure he would fill that form out, even if it was only read by a farmer in outer Siberia or something.
But that stuff is also suitable for an extra layer thing, right? I mean, as much as Nick doesn't like it, we could do like a governance process for governing not just a blacklist, block list, but also a redirect.
But the other thing is,
No,
someone
I
mentioned
will
this
fight
earlier.
you.
Well, that's what we're talking about right now. We're saying, like, okay, let's do the dispute resolution thing extra protocol, and that's what we're saying.
All of the
So you're ready to fight.
I'll say this, my interlock won't be redirecting people. Like, I'm super uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, what I'm saying I will fight you over is if you're talking about a list, a top second layer list that can redirect people to a different resolution based on whether they're subscribed to the list or not. I think that is incredibly dangerous,
Well,
especially for cryptocurrency.
There's a big problem, and talked about it over here just now, is that all of the domains that we registered in the beta, soft launch. See, the thing about the registration process that's kind of like been ingrained is the registrant agrees to terms and end user agreement when they register the domain, and that hasn't happened in any of these.
Yeah.
So to actually turn around now and say, well, the rules changed and now your domain's going there, that's
So that's not quite true,
but-
because the registrar.ens.domains does have a big long legalese page describing to you what you're doing and what the risks
and
are.
what may happen.
And it doesn't, I need to double check the wording, it definitely says that at the end of the interim registrar period, in 2 years-ish, when we deploy the new one, the rules may change in any way.
Well,
I don't recall if it disclaims that it could happen sooner than that or not.
Okay.
One,
But at least something's in there.
Yes.
Something was in there.
But of course,
it's
this is
all
only one way.
right? That's the real law.
Sorry.
Right, like, did your
Like-
interface have the same
Yeah.
legalese?
Yeah, well,
But
that's the
the
thing,
thing is
you-
that, okay, the smart contract allows the key holders to make changes to the smart contract. If you're interacting with that smart contract, and then the key holders make changes to that smart contract, like that's how this is Ethereum, that's the whole point of this thing.
It's true.
Well,
Like,
that's
So
right?
that means, so
Like, break a social
But
pact.
we're not talking about changing ENS, right? We're talking about commissioning an experiment to
Yeah.
build
And I-
a dark list, or whatever you wanna call it.
And maybe a dispute resolution list.
you're just saying it to irritate me, aren't you?
That anybody can optionally choose to implement in their Ethereum related process.
I think this was a tangent about modifying the contract.
Actually, yeah, and now that I think about it, you might not have an option but to do it that way because of all the delays that have already been registered. Because like you said, you can't just change the smart contracts.
Well,
Sorry, to do it one way as
we
opposed to.
can.
We can change it. We can change it.
No, that's what I'm
No,
saying.
try and change it.
Like,
Yeah.
we can't, like, okay, so let's just, like, for those who don't know. So when the DAO came into existence, right, it was like this super decentralized thing, and it was like the DAO, right? And it was like, that was the thing. It's like, the whole point of it was that you can't change it, okay? And that's what everyone thought they wanted in Ethereum, and then we discovered that we don't actually want that yet because nothing is secure yet. So now we have these little, like, fail safes, that the lever that you can pull when, everything goes to crap. And I think for the most part, everyone in this room is in agreement that, like, as we build these really intricate systems, we have these fail safes and these levers that as we learn things and as we grow and as things go wrong, like, we don't destroy, like, the world, we just, like, pull the lever and, like, learn and get better, and then eventually you take the lever out and everyone's happy. And I think I think that people that are interacting with Ethereum today are all pretty much on the same page that, if they're interacting with a smart contract, if they're part of the ENS, that they should have that understanding that things are going to evolve and change. That should be an understanding because that's how it is on the chain in the code.
It should also check the URL that they're visiting.
Just referring back to the report log, how many of the people do you think really get that?
Oh, well, this is the thing. I think that there's two, like, in reality, I think there's two groups of people. I think there's people that don't give a crap. And if you tell them that, this is changing, they're gonna be like, okay, cool, whatever. And I think that there's some people that that understand it. And I think there's a very, very, very small percentage of people that do understand and do give a crap. And those are the people that are going to be the loudest, and those are going to be the people that, like, fight on this and, they want it one way and they want it their way and everyone else agrees the wrong way no matter which argument you provide. And honestly, I've learned does not care about those people because they're the people that like prevented Bitcoin from working for like 2 freaking years, and like that was pretty easy at the end of the day. Like those are those people.
So I think a lawyer would tell you that the
Well, I'm not a lawyer.
no, and nor am I, but I'm channeling one, or I'm trying to. I'm probably a dead one, I guess. I think they would tell you that users' expectations of what the code does and a user's expectations of how the system will behave can be two different things, and just because they understand that the code can be upgraded and replaced doesn't mean that they might have claimed that you violated their expectation of the wider system. So
yeah, I mean, well, let me ask you this then, Nick. Like, you know, as key holders, should we be concerned about, you know, the upgrade that we did to the smart contract 3 months ago?
No, I don't think we should be, but then so my own view is lawyer light, effectively, in that I think that if you don't tell somebody that they can expect something from you, then they've got no reason to expect that from you, in short. So, however, real lawyers probably disagree with me, probably quite loudly.
No, actually, you probably are on point with that, but like the other party is going to argue to shit with
That's
their
exactly
lawyer
it,
to
yes.
go after you for it.
So not putting like human readable terms and conditions on the site might be a problem if, you know, somebody says, well, I was reasonably led to believe that I was keeping this name forever, and there was nothing to say otherwise, even though the underlying technical system could technically permit you to change the rules, you know.
So then now I have another question, like, you know, if my Etherwallet provides like the contract interface, or MetaMask is even a better example, and they use those systems to interact with the smart contract that's on the chain, am I supposed to always, like, if I allow anyone to interact with any smart contract, right? Am I supposed to provide terms and disclosures on my Etherwallet for those every single smart contract
And
ever?
that's a big problem in general. Like,
That's not happening right now, I can tell you.
yeah, and how would you even know what those terms and conditions are? Like, you know, there is, and even if you did, there is no way to prevent somebody.
Quick, register terms and conditions.
But even if you could, there's no way to prevent somebody from interacting with a contract without agreeing to the terms and conditions that you put up there. Like, they can just go, yeah, I see your terms and conditions, but I'm going to ignore them and just send the message using Web3. You know, how are you going to stop me?
Right, exactly.
This is a cool idea for, like, it would be a protocol contracts can adhere to make them Ricardian, so they can like include a link to human readable terms to help establish those kinds of.
So we were
human
just actually
expectations.
talking about whatever ERC 190.
ERC 190.
I think it might
No, but like adding a metadata field for terms and conditions.
Yeah,
would be
I would
pretty
love to
trivial.
display that with the transaction.
I mean, yeah, I just have the field.
I mean, sure, people can still ignore it, but.
Yeah.
People will still ignore it.
But that's not the point.
But the lawyers won't. Right, the lawyers won't.
And
And it would give me, like, as my Etherwallet, it would give me the ability to put a disclaimer that the smart contract people wrote and display it.
I mean, we already put license stuff in there, so
Yeah.
adding another kind of like suggested, hey, your terms.
And at some point, I suspect the lawyer would say, you only didn't see and agree to these terms and conditions because you explicitly avoided them, at which point.
But this feels like a tangent
It is.
aside,
No, I totally
aside from like, okay, if we want to build this thing, there's a big difference between everybody in the room saying, yeah, that's a great idea, and like, how do we actually do it?
So I have a proposal and a straw poll. The proposal comes from Alexander Sand, who is coming but couldn't make it here. And under the assumption that on-chain dispute resolution was a thing worth doing, he proposed something along the lines of the following, which was an escalating arbitration system. Effectively, the way it works is you have a whole bunch of people appointed to be arbitrators, and anyone can file a dispute against a name by paying a fee, at which point the random selection of, say, 3 arbitrators is selected to judge the outcome. If either party doesn't like the result of the outcome, they can choose to escalate and make an appeal, in which case 7 arbitrators are selected at random. And if they appeal again, then 15 arbitrators are selected. And eventually the ultimate Supreme Court is every single arbitrator in the system. And of course it gets progressively more expensive to do so. And arbitrators are rewarded depending on whether they voted according to the, if they're appealed, they only get paid for their time if they were upheld, basically. The idea being that you should be able to rely on even a very small group of arbitrators to follow the consensus because they know that they're only going to get paid if they rule fairly effectively.
Because if they don't, then people escalate.
Yeah.
That's right. And this is very similar
Wait,
to
doesn't that
proposed-
incentivize people to vote to not voice their dissenting opinions?
Yes, of course.
If they believe that they're in the minority.
And that absolutely is an issue.
But that's like
Well,
the opposite of what you want to do.
No, so I would say
You
that
want to encourage.
an arbitrator, an individual arbitrator would still get paid if they are in the minority vote. But if the majority votes against it and then they're overturned in appeal, then they don't. So you're welcome to voice your dissent, and if you are in the minority, then you'll still get paid for voicing your dissent. It's only if you all, rule what is later determined to be wrongly that you don't get recognised.
So you don't get paid if you get overturned?
Yes.
Even if you're in the minority.
No.
Well,
if you're not,
and have the correct vote on the overturn.
If you, that's a good point.
So if you're in the minority, you're not going to be.
I vote no. The majority votes yes. He gets overturned to a no.
And now he doesn't get
I
paid.
lose my money.
You get paid because you
No,
have
you got paid because you.
Yeah.
You were, yeah.
But that wasn't what I was saying a moment ago. So you're right, that is a problem. In any case, I believe the fine details could be argued over at length, but I thought it was an interesting proposal. However, it seems now more than half the people, or about half the people in the room believe that it's an irrelevant proposal. So my straw poll is...
Not necessarily, because you could use that to govern darkness.
You could, yes, that's true. It wouldn't in that case necessarily have to be on chain, but yeah, that would be that's a good point. If we're going to architect a dispute system as if it was the permanent, full thing, then that would be a valid consideration.
Can I do another straw poll where we talk about whether the previous question was something we were me? Okay.
Wait, can we finish that straw poll?
I haven't asked my question yet, but
Oh yeah, okay. Well, can I just say that when I'm not opposed to having a dispute resolution in the ENS first level, lowest level, on-chain, whatever you want to call it. But right now, I think our best path forward would be to learn more, experiment more, and do something not in the ENS. Are there others with me on that?
that is exactly the question I was about to ask. How many people here would be happiest of the available alternatives with a system that is initially off-chain but built as a full-fledged dispute resolution system with the goal of learning and building a useful long-term system?
So you said the word off-chain, and I don't know how that applies.
Sorry, as a second-level system rather that doesn't directly affect ENS.
So let me see if I can rephrase this, and this is really your question. Are you still okay with the goal of eventually doing a dispute resolution if a bunch of experiments work out, not in the core ENS, but at another way?
No, I was thinking more, would you be in favour of a system that starts as a second layer solution and if successful, becomes a part of the core infrastructure?
This is exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Should we commit this versus
Now we have it worded in 3 different ways, so they're all very clear.
Is there any way to actually enforce the results of the second layer one on ENS?
You have to read the upgrade ENS.
Not on ENS itself.
No, we would
unless you
be
make it
relying
part
on
of
the
core.
wall of the clients, right?
So initially it would be opt-in only for resolvers or people resolving games. So who would see that as a good system to implement initially?
So with explicitly the goal of moving to dispute resolution in ENS.
Were it to,
if it were to be successful.
I think the
If the
explicit
experiments
goal
were.
is to experiment and see what happens.
So that if the experiments say that this is great, then we would do it. So we do experiment design for a reason, right? We don't just do experiments for
Okay.
lulls,
With the goal of evaluating whether or not we can design the governance system.
with the intention of designing the governance system if it works out.
Maybe the first
Is it stronger? Is it stronger? I don't know.
I'm with you, I just don't like anchoring it to the, and then we will build a governance system.
Supposing that such
There
a
has to be a governance system, whether it starts in ENS or at a second level, to me, is immaterial. But I think should there be a governance system? Yes, but some people say no. So I mean,
Yeah,
that's
I
like,
think-
should there be or shouldn't there be?
I think the number of people who say no, there shouldn't be one even at a second level is very small.
Just
Most-
from inference, we haven't
From
done a job.
inference, I think most of the people who voted against layer one dispute resolution were doing so because they preferred layer two
Right.
resolution, or at least initially.
Maybe it'd be good to briefly mention a couple of the downsides to having just layer two dispute resolution. One of them is that if you're only doing the filtering at the client level, then on-chain entities won't benefit from that blacklist unless they pass through. I guess if it's an on-chain,
It's on-chain.
they can check both.
Yeah, it would be on-chain.
Yeah, okay, so you can check both,
Governance
but
on-chain.
it wouldn't have as seamless a migration path.
More gas.
Yeah, more gas.
Oh, just a
Any
clarification.
other ones who?
Yeah, just a clarification question. It's the assumption covers ETC traffic because my Ethereum covers ETC background, but better not. Yeah. Right.
I think you can point it at an ETC node, you just don't have a default provider.
Yeah, superfluous. Yeah, unrelated. We don't talk about all points.
So when we have a question we can actually agree on asking. Yeah, all in favor?
So, let me just respond to Dan. There are the other main costs, I think, having the name registry change only kind of on the second system, is that if there are abusive applications, then you would still use them on the DNS route because it'll opt-in nature of it, right? Whereas like if it was actually governed, then somehow the only way to like opt into using the kind of abusive things would be to like actually use a different system.
It's a little weaker, yeah.
It's weaker, yeah. It's less. That's right. It's less of a less iron fisted.
Less risk too.
Less risk too, but also it depends on what you mean by risk. It's less implementation risk, less risk to ENS as currently, but not necessarily less risk to the users. Not necessarily less risk to third parties, right?
Right. Less risk to the ENS system.
That's right. Yeah.
So I guess something that pops up out of this at the moment is we can sit here and talk about a second layer system, but when someone comes knocking on the door saying kiddieporn.eth needs to be taken down, we say, oh, we'll do it, but it's only advisory.
Sorry. Well. I mean, so who is we here? So we haven't really said who's governing this blacklist, right? Like,
Well, it's not a blacklist, we're talking about ENS at this stage, aren't we? This is the thing.
Oh, I thought we were okay. So the people on the blacklist would say, okay, well, add it to the blacklist. The ENS, the only people who can change that are basically the key holders, and also with the hard fork, the whole the community.
Okay, so
those are the two kind of those are the three places with the top level, with the second layer.
So we get hard fork for now, let's focus on the second one. So is that going to be part of the system, or are you going to turn around and say, sorry, we don't have the capability of doing it? I mean, it's there, but
it is part of the system.
Is it something
You deny the
that
capability.
you, the quorum of key holders, are going to turn around and say, yes, we're open to doing that, because now we've got a first layer system as well?
Well, I think, we don't have like a policy for this. I mean,
That's what I mean, that's what I was about to say, like honestly, if that were to happen right now, I'm pretty sure 4 key holders would find a way to be in agreement over it and figure out a solution.
Yeah, probably.
But it would probably be better if we had a policy in place that we were in semi-agreement on maybe.
So my own,
I don't know.
My own personal policy on something like this is that if I'm served with a court order in a court I recognise to sign a request to take a domain down, regardless of whether I agree with that court order or not, then I will sign a request to take a domain down. And it's up to the distribution of geographical, of key holders to determine whether that reaches a quorum or not. That's for 2 reasons. One, because I generally trust that the courts often make good decisions, and if you can get it in multiple jurisdictions, then it's more likely to be consistently good. And the other is simply to cover my ass, because I don't want to go to jail over, contempt of court because I refuse to do something. And again, relying on the geographical distribution, that if it was a terrible idea, then hopefully only that my local court would be stupid enough to try and make it do it.
Would your local court still lock you up in the meantime?
The
interesting one.
Well, so obviously it depends on the judge, but I don't think a judge could hold me in contempt of court for doing everything I can in order to affect the ruling. If a judge says you must solve the halting problem, and I fail to solve the halting problem, then I don't think they can hold me in contempt of court.
But what is the geographical distribution? Are there 4 in the US alone?
That's a good question. I don't think we have 4 in the US alone. Taylor is.
I'm in the US, I'm in
Yeah.
California.
Oh, yeah, there's 4, isn't there?
Yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. There's one central point of failure.
Alright, gotta get rid of all this.
Yeah, it's okay though, because we can hardcore ENS. You need hardcore the protocol.
And one Bennett, who isn't here. One Bennett.
Yeah.
You know, the guy who's making millions of dollars on an ICO at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
I thought it was like 250.
Yeah, it's 250, yeah.
Yeah, I forgot.
Depends on how you value it.
It's not here.
Yeah, and what prices, you know.
Busy. Make them look good.
But anyways, yeah, so I should repeat that because I don't think it really got across. Suppose that the root multi-sig is compromised. We could just deploy a new ENS and like tell everyone, hey, look, this is a new ENS address. Sorry, it wasn't upgraded in the normal way. We had a compromise. So like hard forks are really, really powerful mechanism, right? And then I'm not even hard forking the protocol. It's a hard fork of ENS, not of Ethereum, right? It's just repointing the resolvers on the front ends to this new account. And so as long as that, I mean, there is some cost to doing that, no question. But it's possible, right? Oh, you deploy a new contract. Tell everyone point their things there.
How do you, that's the part, how do you, I'm coming from a complete, I know nothing, how do you tell everyone?
So basically, like you ask money in their wallet, post it on there. You basically, it's just a social mechanism.
So it's a social.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah.
And like.
No, it'd be the same thing as
Even hard forks aren't like that.
Yeah,
They're
the miners have to.
not just the miners. The miners are really like minority, very small.
The Augur token contract just did this recently.
It was actually
Yeah.
quite easy to get in touch with
So-
everyone. We did it in about 48 hours.
Yeah, why don't you walk, because you guys, one, that's a perfect example, but two, like you guys handled it well, so why don't you share a little bit about that process and what it was like?
Well, we got kind of lucky because we found that there was an exploit in the Serpent compiler which allowed you to exploit the REC token contract, which the exploit allowed you to actually change the creation timestamp of the token indefinitely, almost indefinitely, freezing token transfers. So we got lucky where we were actually able to freeze the prior token. So we did that ourselves. We froze the token for 32 billion years, and essentially 32 billion years. Then we issued a new token on Solidity, and it was 48 hours of contacting my Ether wallet, Poloniex, Kraken, everybody, and telling them. Surprisingly, 3 of all the services I contacted validated my identity. So that's an interesting thing. Yes, only 3. If somebody contacts you and tells you to freeze trading of an asset on your exchange, validate their identity. Nobody validated my identity. They got my email, and they're like, okay, no problem.
Although
It worked, thankfully. I was honest, but.
playing devil's advocate here, freezing is an undoable operation, and it could be better to act first and then verify rather than wait.
Well, we gave 24 hours notice too.
Yeah, and like, and I was contacted by you guys via an Augur email.
Yep.
Then I had another secondary, I think Joey messaged me on Twitter, and I talked with him on Twitter a lot. And then I had, 3 of our partners message me on various platforms saying, hey, have you heard? So I never verified your identity, but also like I was like, I'm just going with the flow, and then I didn't even change the code at my Ether wallet. You guys did pull requests, and so then I just merged it. It's just really easy for us. So yeah, if you want my Ether wallet to change something, the best way is like, get a hold of us, talk to us, and then do a pull request. Because that's the other thing. Is like, if I'm busy or if we're have 1,000 things going on, I am terrified to like even just copy and paste an address from one place to another. Like, and then I was verifying the address, but I was like, okay.
Just use the ENS.
Yeah, right. And I'm not even in exchange, like I can't even imagine how they operate. They just have to operate with no fear. Like they have some like weird like missing emotion or something.
Or they just like pay for like a lot of lawyers to make them feel better.
Yeah.
So if we were gonna move something forward, I don't foresee who has time to do this.
Do you want, sorry,
It's a
Right.
build a democracy.
Oracle system design?
No. Who has time to build this system?
The second line of dispute system.
Yeah. So it's sort of a rhetorical question. I'm wondering if we think it's a good idea, and we're in some level of agreement that we should move forward on it, and we can come to some agreement. Not necessarily we should not try to do this as a room, but we can come to some agreement of a spec for what this thing looks like. Turns out we do have a platform for contracting arbitrary jobs out for people to do it, and we could probably crowdsource the money to build the system, and we could make it clear that this is an experiment, but these are the specs, and we could get something built on eFlance for.
So from my point of view, if this is something that is the future of ENS, then it's probably my job to either write it or to find somebody to write it.
Okay, sorry,
So I might have to do a whip round of the hat to pay for it, but
Tax every held ENS thing. A tiny fraction.
You just need to open a chip jar for it.
I can't actually. So
I don't think that'll just work. Though. You can't just throw money at things and hope they'll get solved. I mean, it's really like there's like. I think the challenge is finding people who are able to work on the problem, right?
Fair point.
Not just the devs, but the kind of the architecture research part. Like you said earlier, like these are if we can solve this, it opens the doors for lots of apps, right? Lots of apps rely on subjective sources of information that can't just be verified in smart contract. But we're really talking about pretty difficult problems that there's a bunch of people who've already spent time on in the space, a bunch of people who have spent time on related problems outside the space. I don't think it's just a matter of typing out some code.
I actually think, and I know I come from totally outside the space, but I'd be surprised if we got anywhere this weekend where we walk out and say, here's the policy or here's the whatever. I mean, the closest we're going to get this weekend would be almost to create a meta structure around that. Like I've talked with you about it before, I don't think a Gitter channel is going to do it in the sense of maybe create. And I hate to sound like a bureaucrat, right? Because I get this with ICANN meetings and all this stuff. It's all working groups and task forces and steering committees, but I almost think at this level, you need something like that to say, okay, we're going to be the people who leave this place and say, we're going to start steering things, nudging things towards a resolution or a policy.
I agree.
Something.
And as far as I'm concerned, the goal of this 3 days is we all start off pulling in roughly different directions, and hopefully we end up pulling mostly in the same direction, and we can identify groups of people who are prepared to work together to further these things in the future. And we ourselves can figure out which things we're most interested in helping with and how much time we have to do that. But ultimately, it's going to be a combination of steering committees and working groups and so on, working out how it should look, and then some people with lots of time to actually write the code in the design docs and build the infrastructure so that it actually happens.
So here's a question. The change to ENS, you're thinking about just disabling the auction?
Mm-hmm.
You were thinking about that on a 2-year pattern. You're thinking about it much faster, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so somehow I think maybe we're going to want multiple groups of people working on different projects at different time frames. Right? So I think even on the pure economic objective front, there are gains that could be made. Right, the kind of broader question of dispute resolution, arbitration, subjective information for curating and governing a name registry is, I agree, a challenging problem. I don't know that ICANN has solved it. If they have, then maybe we can just port everything. But I think that will take maybe a lot longer than making, say, changes to the auction that make it more fair, or that make it less likely that people lose money, or that, these types of things.
I can think of at least 3 short-term projects that people could start working on as soon as we know how they should work. That's before talking about writing a permanent registrar.
What do you mean? How they should work, meaning how the groups should work together?
No, how those projects should work. So we've started to come to some sort of vague agreement about the direction that an initial disputes process should go.
An experiment for.
Yes, yeah, well, that's
For an extra protocol
issue, but yeah. And there are at least 2 other things I can think of along similar lines that could be more or less entirely independent DNS projects that would improve the ecosystem and that aren't blue sky, you know, require a lot of pre-work before we would even start thinking about them.
What are the other 2?
I knew somebody would have to ask. One of them is DNS integration, so bindings for ENS to support storing DNS records and ultimately things like SSL certificates and so on. And one of them is re-architecting the current registrar to support like swapping out how you figure out who gets the name. So the auction system would become just a plug-in module that you could replace with a first and first served module or whatever. And at the same time, maybe generalizing that auction system so it can be used by anyone wanting to auction resources, which is a secondary goal that I'm working on.
Right. Yeah. You mean actually auction them or auction rights based deposits?
That I guess would be up to how you configure the auction contract, because ultimately the process of auctioning it is the same. It's just what you do with the money afterwards is different.
What does happen with all the
Each winning bid gets put in its own deed contract, which has a very limited API that restricts what can be done with it. If you, after a year, you can relinquish the domain, in which case you get back the entire deposit, or you can keep it, in which case it stays there. When it comes to deploying a new registrar, the deed contract is separate from the registrar. So what happens is we would deploy a new registrar, and then everyone would have to decide whether they want to migrate to the new registrar, which gives it ultimate control over your deposit under whatever the new rules are, or surrender the name and get their deposit back. So the idea is that the rules that you agreed to, or the code that you agreed to governing what can happen to your deposit, can't be changed out from under you without you agreeing to migrate it to the new one.
About the decentralized court, you spoke about earlier. What would happen if there were 2 disputes about the same name at the same time? Would it be possible?
Presumably you would architect it to prohibit resolving them simultaneously.
And can you prevent them from a seller going against himself to an arbitration go?
Well, you can make it expensive.
And you can make it prompt. Like it's going to be ineffective if it costs £5,000 and holds up for a week. You know.
Can I ask another really basic question? Was ETH the name, like the ETH domain or namespace? Is that something that like the Ethereum Foundation said we need a naming system and ETH is going to be it and Nick and a bunch of guys go figure this out, or
no? So ENS was built because I joined the foundation and started looking at naming stuff and talked to Alex and some others, and we sort of hashed it out. And I built the architecture because it seemed like a big hole there. The foundation would want me to say that they pay for my work doing, and Alex's and some others' work developing the code behind ENS. Just like, you know, the Free Software Foundation pays for development of Bind, but the foundation is unaffiliated with the deployment of ENS on Ethereum as, you know, the top level registry and so on. That is a community endeavor. So, yeah, so supposedly this session is for talking about technical considerations for implementation of a dispute system. Is that something people think would still be valuable to discuss? I mean, I probably think it would be. Any further comments first on the social aspects? We've spent a lot of time on it, but I kind of feel like we've come to a natural switching point unless anyone else has a comment. I guess I'll kick things off in that it seems like it ought to be possible to build a layer 2 system like this in a broadly compatible way with the current ENS system. So I'm talking about writing, say, a second registry contract that just looks things up in the main registry contract by default, but has a blacklist that it will always return zeros for. And that means that employing this dispute system, agreeing to use it would simply be a matter of using a different route contractors for your registry. And that would make life extremely easy on wallets and others. They just literally choose which contract they're using as their route. There would be a small additional, gas overhead in looking things up, but that's more or less irrelevant when you're doing local calls, except insofar as it affects latency. Of course, this is kind of the smallest of the associated problems, because the real problem is how do you encode a dispute, that you have filed one, how do you encode the resolution, how do you determine when it should be escalated and when it's been resolved, and how to pay people and all that sort of stuff.
I was also going to ask is it separate, or would this be a technical component of this process? Who is conversation? Because if you're going to start a dispute resolution, it's against this name and that's all you know, this name, this address, or you can actually start thinking about who is it against. How are you going to?
So is the point of who is primarily to provide notice?
No, it started historically, it was just point of contact, right? Admin and technical POC, that's it. They never thought this was going to happen, right? So it's a gigantic mess and everybody knows it. And even the evolution of where it's going is a gigantic mess and everybody knows it. And nobody knows what's going to happen. And there's like new data privacy laws out of Europe that has just like ICANN crapping itself because, next year, we might not be able to show who is data for like European domains, and it's just
awesome. How does that destroy ICANN's business?
It doesn't destroy their business with, but right now, like you have all kinds of reasons to have to get in touch with the people who are responsible for other domains, either at admin or technical or abuse level. This happens every day, all day, and even with, let's say, a lot of people use domain privacy, but you can figure out who's running the technical underpinning for the domain, and somewhere you're going to find someone who actually you can talk to, like whether it's the web host or the transit provider. You only can do it with who's, really. It's the only two.
Yeah, but I mean, just talking about crypto generally, we know, we can do way cooler stuff than this. I mean, we know a lot of ways actually to contact people without knowing a lot about them.
So that's like great.
There's this cool thing I learned about recently called magic wormhole.
Okay.
Where if you and someone else have the same string, you can for one time establish send a channel set a message along that channel, and then if you forget that string, the channel's gone forever.
It's sounding to me like it would be that it should maybe be a separate conversation.
Yeah. So I think addressing people, providing notice to people, is a super interesting space. It's actually related to name registrations, but actually, I've never found that I'm unable to accomplish the goal with by posting zero knowledge proofs. I can pretty much post encrypted data at zero knowledge proofs, or just hashes in zero knowledge proofs really, and never have to have anything other than that on what would be required for you to send someone a message.
And ultimately, the system itself could simply provide an API that allows you to access what disputes are open, and then anyone could build an external oracle that goes, or an external service that looks up current disputes, checks for who has data on that name, and if you've entered it, then sends you an email saying, hey, you've got an open dispute. So we could build that extraneous to the core dispute resolution system.
And you could even have a system eventually one day where someone provides proof that there is a dispute. Only if you're involved in that dispute can you interpret it and be able to tell that you're a part of that dispute, right? And then there could be some other proofs that are provided to show that the process is going on, but actually very little information ever needs to be responsive. This is kind of a snarky feature. Anyways, I would love to talk kind of abstractly about governance. I think that all of this stuff that we're talking about really is talking about governance, dispute resolution, Oracle systems, all these things at the end of the day are governance processes. And I think that I can provide a couple of interesting tools for thinking about governance that have like helped me quite a lot. And there's basically, like, if you don't mind, I'll just look at the whiteboard.
Yeah.
There's basically like two kinds of key things that I know. Well, two things that I kind of know how to look at. Firstly, I'm going to just like define what a governance process is in this really general abstract way. I'm just going to say that a governance process, it's going to map something called inputs to some things called decisions. So somehow it's a process that implements a function which takes some inputs, maybe like, over time, not all at once, and then returns something called a decision. And there's kind of like there's this kind of axis where I can kind of like put governance systems, and on one axis we have basically I'm going to call it fully institutionalized or fully formalized, or like this is kind of like at the maximum formal, right? And then on this side it's kind of the most ad hoc. This is kind of just the ad hoc side. And then in the middle, we kind of can have some things that are kind of in between, where it might not be like a full formalized rule that we all know and that everyone agrees with, but there might be kind of tacit knowledge that different people will participate, or maybe norms. Basically, like, so we have kind of like norms and tacit knowledge that kind of feed into this. But basically, so what I'm basically gonna claim is that, okay, firstly, anything that fits this definition type checks as governance. Okay, I haven't said what these are, but just bear with me while I'm vague. And I think it's gonna be useful, right? So then what I'm gonna say is basically that, like, when you give a governance system, really what you're gonna say is, okay, here are the things that are the formal rules, right? Here's like the type signature that we know it has. And then there's gonna be all sorts of implementation things that are gonna, be in the system that satisfies this type, right? So for example, there is there might be a rule about how many votes are required and for a result, but the formal rules might not say how things are brought to a vote. But that's still, for the process to be implemented, somehow something needs to be brought to a vote, and basically there ends up being governance ends up having a part that's kind of formalized, something where people agree on the terms and they know what's going on, and a part where people are kind of turning the knobs sometimes based on norms and kind of established things that maybe aren't quite formal rules. Sometimes based on just like a totally ad hoc process. Sometimes there's like tacit knowledge that they use to make sure that the right inputs are getting into the system for the governance goal, right? And so if you were to have, say, like a governance system that basically says, consult this ideal oracle and then make whatever decision it says we should do, that could be like super fully formalized, because like there's no inputs that it requires from the outside at all in order to make a decision. As soon as you start to have governance be like a bike where someone has to steer and pedal, then you're talking about a system where the formal parts aren't actually the whole of the governance system, but there's actually parts that aren't specified in the bike that are relevant for how the bike is actually governed over time, right? Like how you steer, how you paddle, how you maintain it. And that's stuff that you might have norms for, that you might do just through tacit knowledge, or something that you just might do on an ad hoc kind of basis, right? And so the idea is that like formal governance rules, or in some lesser extent norms, and even lesser extent tacit knowledge, and even lesser extent ad hoc decisions, are basically type definitions on the governance system. And so basically, like, and then so we can think about what are the formal rules as a type definition, and then we can think about all the implementation details as also being part of the governance. So governance is it's got a couple of things, right? It's got the formal rules, and then the kind of informal and other weird implementation details. Like, so let's take a look at Ethereum, right? We have the EEPS process. There are some formal rules to the EEPS process. There is a certain format that's kind of expected. You have to have a GitHub account in order to post an issue on the EEPS repo, in the EEPS repo on the Ethereum GitHub, in order to create an EEP, right? So you need to have
a GitHub account to create an EAP. That's like a formal rule of the EAPS process. There's a certain format that EAPS are kind of expected to take, and this is a newer kind of rule. There's some discussion that needs to happen, and then if some condition which you don't really know, then it'll end up in this thing called the alt devs call. The alt devs call is another great governance institution that we have, like a really nascent governance institution. It governs specs for future implementations of Ethereum. And there's also, to some extent, formal rules, right? It's an invite-only call every second Friday, where today, in fact, okay, where basically anyone who's a core maintainer or Vitalik or invited by a representative of the Ethereum Foundation can attend. And the goal of this institution, apparently, every single time except for one, is to come out with unanimous consensus on like what to do in terms of the spec of the next release, right? And so some of EAPs kind of feed into that somehow. EAPs are governed separately, right? But there are certain things that we know about them, right? And then there's a bunch of stuff that's kind of up to implementation. Like what do people actually decide to do in terms of pay attention to and comments, right? That's usually on an ad hoc basis. Sometimes people get like, someone knows that there's something concerning going on, and so they'll spend a bunch of time on a particular EAP. But that's part of the governance process, but it's not part of the governance institution, right? It's not part of the rules, right? And over time, we're seeing more norms arise around these things. And so basically what I'm saying is like, EAPs, alt devs call, for example, even the roadmap, there are some formal kind of rules that have to be satisfied by the decisions made by these governance institutions. There's also lots of stuff that's left to the implementation, right? There's lots of stuff that is kind of not common knowledge, not commonly specified, not just the rules of the system, but how things end up playing out in practice because someone has to be there turning the wheels and moving the bike, right? The bike doesn't say how to do that, but someone has to do it or else nothing happens, right? And so basically what I'm saying is that the formal rules of a governance system are kind of like a type definition, and there's a lot left to the implementation, right? So when we're talking about the rules for the dispute resolution system or for governing ENS, we're going to be talking about kind of two separate things. One of them is like, what are the formal rules, right? And then another thing is like kind of what are the norms that we want to cultivate, what needs to be true maybe about the implementation for us to get the result that we need out of these rules, right? Because in a fully formalized system, you could just guarantee the right results out of the rules, hopefully, right? Whereas in a system that isn't fully formalized, where things are kind of left to the implementation somewhat, as like this ENS thing will be if we ever do dispute resolution, there's going to be kind of, these pedals and levers that have to be pulled by someone somewhere. And the way in which they do that will greatly impact the decision and the outcome. And the rules that are formalized will also will kind of restrict what can happen, right? Or how things can happen. And so basically my claim here is that like you can understand formal rules and to a lesser extent norms, and lesser extent tacit knowledge, and even lesser extent ad hoc decisions of a governance system in terms of type definitions in their implementations. Which I think is really cool. I'm not sure if that is if that makes sense to anyone or everyone. Show of hands if it makes sense. Don't be shy. You don't have to pretend to make sense. Okay. And then the other. So this is one thing that I found really useful, and basically, and about kind of saying, okay, what the decisions are on, and kind of who and how the inputs happen. We can really start to see that like Ethereum governance is made up of a bunch of different components that govern different pieces of something that eventually feeds into governance decisions on the individual nodes and whether the individual nodes decide to upgrade, right? And when I say something like I really am afraid of institutionalized governance, what I really mean, it turns out, once I realize how to have better language, is that I don't want institutionalized software upgrades, right? Like I think a node should be like their own kind of, there should be no formal rules on how a node should upgrade, right? However, they only have certain upgrades to choose from that were, that people were able to produce, and then that process has somehow there's benefit from having that governed, right? From having these, for example, calls, so we have consensus on a spec, so the different implementations don't fall out of consensus, for example.
So there's different parts of the ecosystem that require governance in different ways and have different types of decisions, right? And somehow if you can see them fit together and see what parts are formalized and what parts are left up to the implementation, you can get a rich, detailed, I think arbitrarily precise picture of what governance of a particular blockchain actually looks like. And you can, so not just in terms of like this kind of who says what, who thinks what, but also in terms of the structure that restricts people's decisions in terms of the governance institutions that exist, right? And governance institutions actually like arise through practice and through kind of norms that come out of like tacit knowledge that maybe came out of ad hoc decisions initially. And so there's some extent to which we, just by observing governance systems, we can learn a lot about how these things work, and maybe that can help us engineer governance systems for name registries and lots of other things. And so basically the question that I kind of want to ask here is like, what do we stand a chance to formalize? And probably we're going to find not very much. Basically, like something along the lines that what Alice gave, like with more, like with more arguments about what exactly the right numbers are. But the next kind of question is like, what kind of norms need to exist for that to lead to a good result, right? What kind of tacit knowledge do people need to have actually for them to give the right input about whether this is squatting or not, or whether it's bad faith registration or not, whether it's abusive or not. And so basically, like, I kind of encourage you to think about governance of Ethereum, not just in terms of the rules or the name registry, not just in terms of the formal rules, but also in terms of the norms and knowledge and ad hoc kind of community that is going to be around it, right? Because that is really doing a lot of the work to implement this governance system, right? There are going to be some rules that are enforced by the smart contract, and that's great because like somehow that's going to provide some fairness to people who are participating in the system in a way that like this stuff just can't, because there's kind of somehow no accountability here as far as anyone's concerned if they can only look at the blockchain. But if you are part of one of these dispute resolution systems, maybe you adhere to norms, maybe you propagate norms, maybe you respond to the things that even before you can propagate them. And that will feed into the governance process, but it's not just simply the governance rules. And so with that, I'll take a little break. And I have one more thing, but the next thing is really simple, relatively speaking. Yeah, please.
You described something that sounds to me makes a lot of sense, but it's super generic.
Yeah, I'm being really abstract.
It means that maybe in the long term, makes sense to define the process and think about all the arguments and parameters that this is going to take as an input and decision points and all that stuff. But how do you translate it to like short-term implementation? Like I'm thinking that it's more important, for example, to like define, make sure that the system is upgradable.
Sure.
So that the process can be refined and
yeah, and the process for upgrading it is itself a governance
anyway.
institution that has certain formal rules and will have certain implementation, and it will govern this other thing that maybe will actually be a governing system itself that we're trying to upgrade and make suitable, right? But and so I don't disagree with you, but I think that actually like being a little abstract I don't think it's hurting us, and actually I think it will help. I think it can totally help us kind of do this kind of reasoning backwards to say, okay, here's our end goal. What would we need to have to accomplish it? And then what would we need to have that, right? To kind of answer those questions or to ask them correctly, like you need to operate, I think, at a certain level of abstraction because you don't know the details about everything that you need to have, right?
Just trying to be more practical.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we could see this be practical quick. We should give it a shot, right?
If I understand correctly, if this is like building jurisprudence around name swapping and all domain names things.
Yeah. So what I would like probably in terms of domain names, probably what I would say is okay, we need a bunch of different governance processes, right? Okay, one of them is for shutting down names in the case of abuse. One of them is for making names auctionable again in the case that they get lost. Another one might be changing the owner of a name, right? And maybe those will be like 3 separate processes that output 3 different types of decisions. And we need to think about, okay, what do those have to look like, right? And then what we often end up into right away is this fact that, oh, there's actually what we can often come up with is like, there's no really good formal rule that we can use. So instead we have to seek input from people and like kind of do this kind of voting or aggregation, signal aggregation type stuff, right? And then that's kind of where the next part of the conversation I want to talk to you about is basically the liveness versus safety thing, which I've kind of mentioned before. So this is like a trade-off in voting systems, right? Where like a system that will always return an outcome is like all the way over here in liveness, where basically it'll always make a decision. A thing that's safe will always make kind of the right decision, right? And it turns out there's like this trade-off because if you want to always make the right decision, then you have to like not make a decision when not everyone agrees. So somehow, let me put it this way: it's more unanimity is kind of way more safe than majority vote, because you need a smaller number of people to actually be honest or to be right to get the right outcome. Whereas in a majority vote, it could easily be that the people who are right are in the minority, and then but at least you get a result, right? Whereas in here, if you have a unanimous decision, then you're not going to get a result at all if people don't agree, right?
So on the safety end of things, you have juries, and on the liveness end of things, you have Eurovision, effectively.
Yeah, I think that's not bad, right? So I think Eurovision, or like these kind of tournaments, the binary tournaments, are basically like they're guaranteed to give you a winner. Probability that it's the best winner, it's really not the best, right? The best system is to have like everyone play every other person and to tally the scores to see who wins the most, right? But there's too many games there, right? We're talking about like n squared games. And so we choose to have a less safe one in order to get something that gives us a result,
Liveness might be the ENS registrar itself, and what we're adding are layers of safety that
yeah, maybe. Yeah. So right now, the ENS registrar will always make registries, right? Always make registrations as long as someone bids and reviews. So it's not always. There's a little bit of lack of liveness, but mostly it's very live in the sense that it does very little to make sure that the registries are safe in this sense, right? If what it means for a registry to not be safe is that it violates some of these cases of abuse. Of various kinds, I guess. So in that sense, I think that the ENS very much is favoring liveness right now. And then and so if we were to have say unanimous voting between a single large set of I don't know, let's call them curators, before every registration happened, and they had to sign off on it unanimously, then we would have almost no registrations, but all the ones that were there would have every one of those people agree to those registrations, and therefore they would probably be safe in some way, right? They're probably not child porn, they're probably not fraud or abuse, they're probably not trademark infringement, because each one of these named people who somehow were selected in a way, who knows, that we trust, right? At least one of them will kind of always lead to safe registrations. And so basically what I'm saying is, we're not going to be able to have a fully formalized system. We're going to have to have some voting and some basically these pedals and levers for steering the governance system. And for those pedals and levers, we're going to have to make a liveness and safety trade-off. And so basically what I'm saying is, the perfect system where we have a fully formalized thing that just looks at an oracle and decides the optimal thing always, it's not going to happen. Right? We're gonna end up having something that's less than fully formalized, and then we're also gonna need to sacrifice on safety. And so I'm basically saying I'm pointing out that there are limits to what we can do, and also hopefully giving you some language to think about governance in a little bit more of a fine-grained way, rather than just thinking about blockchain governance in really abstract or sweeping terms. Hope this helps.
I'd like to sit down now.